Evening, I'd like to call to order the Lakewood City Council study session in the city of Lakewood, Colorado on April 2nd, 2018 at 7 p.m. in council chambers. This is also World Autism Awareness Day, so I think that kicks off a month of autism awareness, and we will kick that off here tonight. So with that, will the clerk please call roll?
Paul.
Here.
Johnson.
Present.
Vincent. Beta. Here. Franks.
Here.
Gutwein. Here. LeBure.
Here.
Skilling.
Here.
Harrison.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Roybal.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great, thank you very much. So we have a couple of agenda items tonight, and our first thing up is going to be an update on our housing study. This is probably the third, fourth, fifth time we've had this opportunity, but now it's really starting to get in from what it looks like on a piece of paper to what it looks like on the ground level. So with that, I will turn it over to Nanette, who looks like she's waiting for David, who is here. Yeah, he's here. I think he went to the restroom. Well, here's the deal. If you remember, I think the last time he was here was the NCAA football championship night. And tonight is the NCAA basketball championship night. So,
Well, I'll set the stage, and then I'm sorry, I apologize. We had, as the mayor said, about 5 study sessions on the housing study, and it was all the groundwork that was laid. It was a lot of data compilation to paint a picture of what Lakewood looks like and some of the kind of the cohorts that kind of indicate what housing needs could be like, depending on what policy decisions were made. As a result of that, the last meeting you had was a draft. You received a report. We had all the data that was voluminous over the many study sessions that you had, with the idea that we would the next dialogue would start the policy discussion. So I wanted to emphasize that the policy discussion that we're starting is David's going to give you a presentation of the background for those 3 council members that were not here and seated on council, to give you kind of a highlight of the executive summary. Then he'll pose a bunch of questions to you, entering and having the desire to have a dialogue, to start having you think of what are those policies that you want to start considering putting in place. And then he'll start going through the pros and cons of policies, so you have a sense of which ones that you want to go, because the policy direction comes from you, but he's trying to be here to be the facilitator for you to bring up the correct policy discussion. So with that, David, you're up already. I was sandbagging a bit here for you.
Nanette, you did a very nice job.
Thank you, Nanette. I'm fashionably late at 3 minutes and 25 seconds. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say it's very nice to be in front of you again. I'm sorry it's been 6 months. I know that there have been a lot of things take place between then and now. There are 3 new faces that I'm not familiar with, but I'm sure that through this discussion we can generate some level of familiarity. This is the 5th time we've had a conversation about this effort, and as most of you know, it's an important one. And as Nanette just said, I'm just here as a facilitator of this discussion. We've provided some analysis in a draft report format with findings, a limited number of findings, and I want to discuss generally some of the directions that could be taken. I see there are generally kind of 4 paths moving forward, and what some of the consequences of those paths moving forward might be. It's not a comprehensive list, but it's really I've really just generated this for the sake of facilitating a conversation that all of you can have amongst yourselves and with me as a backstop as well. So let's just dive right into this. So I'd like to review the process with you. Also, for the sake of the three new council members, I'd like to review the process that the brief process that we've gone through. We want to cover some of the major conclusions of that, and then go through some of the limited number of consequences to efforts that might be oriented toward 4 different categories of paths that you could take, and then discuss that where I'd like to establish some type of policy direction, and then we can talk about next steps in establishing policy actions. I want to steer clear in my role of recommending, or shall we say, making policy decisions for you. That's not my role. I can make a bunch of suggestions to you, and I can give you best practices, I can give you case studies, and in some cases I have done that for some of these ideas, but really I want them to come from all of you and from a discussion. So this, I think, is going to be a 2-phase discussion. This tonight is the first phase of a discussion. When thinking about how to make policy, really there is when you establish you want to do this much with this much money, and you want it to accomplish this, is a policy action item. And I don't think that it would be fair to all of you to stand in front of you and suggest X, Y, and Z, and A, B, and C are the things that you should do. Even from our professional perspective, I don't think that that's our role to stand here and say in just one session to you that that's what we think you should do. Take it or leave it, and then I'm done. So backing up, I think that the more appropriate direction to take is to have a conversation with you about whether or not you see the narrative of what's going on in the city in the same way, what you think the issues are, whether you agree with some of the issues that have been identified in the study, and then discuss what direction you want to take. And that direction is a political position. And so that's the conversation that I want to have tonight. The first one is just a bit of a reorientation on the study itself. So these 5 questions on the left side were some of the guiding questions to the study. Will housing continue to meet residents' needs? That is, existing residents and future residents. How does housing impact economic development? Is the housing mix adequate for changing demand? Is the supply of housing in desirable neighborhoods? And how does housing create a vibrant community? Some of these are kind of value laden as well, but I think that those were value laden in the first sense because they do require a bit of a value judgment from the policy perspective. So in terms of the data analysis, there was many of you will recall the massive amount of information we've covered in some of our other work sessions, but we also included a survey of major employers. We had 1,300 plus responses to that. The analysis covered demographics, it covered economics, it covered worker resident preferences, the housing market, an assessment of where and to what extent there were neighborhood amenities and proximities of housing to neighborhood amenities. And we tried to address a number of questions that came up throughout the process. There were some questions that a few of you had, or many of you had, through the process, and we tried to address those. If there are some things that you've seen in the draft report that are missing, please do still let us know. Because I think we've received Councilwoman Karen's responses or questions, but I don't think we've had many other takers on comments on the draft report. So please do avail yourself of the report, at least the executive summary, and give us your feedback. It'll be very helpful. And then just a reminder, so the discussions that we had were last February, March, June, and August, and then we took our hiatus while we are all on vacation, I think, between then and now. Is that right? I know I haven't been. So some of the limited findings, I think, pulling out of the executive summary, looking at the higher level stats here, the city's experienced in the last 15, 16 years a trend of growing by 3 jobs for every 1 new housing unit. Now, we can have a discussion about what that means later on, or you can raise your hand now and maybe we can have a discussion about it. But from our perspective and looking at other cities around the country, thinking about what it means for the MSA, thinking about what it means for Lakewood, it comes with a question, and the question is, do you want to grow your supply of housing so that you can accommodate your new workforce? So people are coming here for jobs. And so the question embedded in this statement is really a question. Do you want to accommodate your new job holders? And do you want them to live here? That's the question underlying that statement. So the workforce is growing. Top performing industries are relying increasingly on in-commuters. That's another component of this trend, is that increasingly people are choosing to as they retire, continue to live in Lakewood, which is a great thing, but with a constrained housing supply, that means that new job holders are having to commute in. So that has implications, that has questions underneath it as well. Local population not growing in proportion. City and region are facing unprecedented growth pressures from the under 35s and the over 55s. So those are unprecedented patterns that the city is experiencing, and the MSA, by the way. And of course, the last piece, limited land to address these patterns and trends. Although the city did facilitate a growth in the targeted growth areas that were identified in the comp plan, and mainly infill or redevelopment is what's going on now. And so I know that embedded in these statements are a number of considerations that I'd like all of us to discuss, or at least I'd like you all to ask questions about and discuss. Stated preferences from the workforce survey, high-level takeaways, choosing where to live. The cost of housing and the quality of construction are the two topmost considerations for everybody. Doesn't matter what age they are. Everybody says the cost is important and the quality of construction is important. Under 35s, and this is not to say that this is not important to them, because this, remember, is top ranking. But under 35, their next highest ones are they want to live near parks, shops, transit, but they're still mindful of safety and security, just like most everybody else is. The 35s to 54s, cost is less important, but they want character. So they're kind of in the working families place, and they're interested more in character, schools, short commute to work. Over 55s then begin to look for lower maintenance living and proximity to services that are very important to them. So the high level finding without the numbers attached to it is that if those that are just working in the city wanted to live here, that is, of the workers we surveyed, representative of the workforce, if they wanted to live here based on what their needs were, the city would have an undersupply of housing in those areas. And that's for all those areas. That's for all those demographics. That's for seniors who want to live in proximity to services, for aged care, for supportive services, so on. And that's the under 35s as well. So I want to reiterate, this study is not just about new residents and meeting their demands. This study is not just about identifying the needs of the under 35s. This is not just about one demographic, and this is not just about one population. So tonight, I want to look at 4 different paths we think that the city has. One is the supply path. You can add inventory. The second is the demand path. You can enhance the community character and just simply make it Lakewood yet a more attractive place to live. You can identify resources, augmenting how we do business, making it better to do business in the city of Lakewood. And you can also take a hands-off approach. You can let the market do what it's going to do, whatever that is. I think there was a Chinese proverb that said something like, unless we change direction, we're likely to end up where we're headed. And so you can take that how you want, but it can go either way. Okay? So the first one is, let's talk about some of the supply side. All right, so one of the options is we can build out, but which way? So the building out is what Lakewood has historically done. And when we looked at this, I don't know, maybe it was last March, maybe it was June or something. We looked at some maps and we looked at the percent of housing inventory that was built at a certain decade. We saw this general pattern of that southwesterly movement of growth. And so as Lakewood had land to accommodate the growth, that was great, it was fine. So now we're up against some boundaries, we're up against other areas. So building out the pros, we have new residential locations or areas that can facilitate the traditional development patterns. To accommodate the additional growth, that would probably mean, because it's traditional development, we would maybe find fewer NIMBY problems than we do today. I'm not sure. That's just a suggestion. On the con side, we'd have to look at annexation, and that gets us into NIMBY concerns, obviously. Potentially negative fiscal impact to the city because it is in the state of Colorado, where we have very low property taxes. New residential development doesn't exactly pay for itself. And I think Councilman Dave Wickman mentioned that in one of our past discussions, that or made that point about new residential development on its own costs the city more than a combination of mix of uses. So that's one way. We could also build up, and this is just an illustration. I've also overlaid those targeted growth areas in the purple areas, and then, I'm imagining Hong Kong style 50 to 90 story building. I'm kidding, not really. So build up in targeted growth areas. This is the other supply direction. So this avoids annexation challenges. It would go in line with meeting different demand segments by adding housing near community amenities and transit, commercial corridors, all those kind of things that some of those demographics are looking for. And if they're in the transit areas, it would lower the transportation system impacts, because when you think about it, in commuters of new job holders, so the city's doing a really great job building its business base and building its job base. But if the in-commuters are increasing, that means you have more people coming in who are not living here and contributing their sales tax dollars. They're spending maybe 10% of their retail expenditure in the community, and then they're spending 90% outside of Lakewood. But meanwhile, they're driving on the roads, and they're creating to the potholes, they're contributing to the potholes and the wear and tear on the roads. So the city's left with all of this road and street O&M, but not the revenue to take care of it. So the cons, NIMBY concerns in this case are likelier. Anytime you're dealing with infill development or redevelopment, you're facing NIMBY concerns. If it's not in transit areas, then it would, again, still, even if you do build up in some growth areas, but they're not in those in the transit areas, then you're still increasing the transportation infrastructure impacts by simply adding more cars to the roads. So another way to go is addressing the demand side, and I tried to find some, PC images, because I recognize it was told to me that my presentations didn't have enough images in them, and they were sometimes difficult to digest. I can appreciate that. I'm not really a marketer per se, and I don't do the softer side of things, so I'll let you all think of the softer side of things, but I still found a little silhouette of what I thought were under 35s. So increasing attractiveness to the under 35s. What does that mean? What are the pros and the cons? All right, so let's think about this. The under 35s spend a lot of their money on all the things that they want to live near, parks, shops, transit, dining, entertainment. So that creates new local residents from the new job holders now and in the future. So this is also the demographic of, in our mind, these are also tomorrow's buyers of Lakewood's traditional housing stock. So, getting the people in the community, and then when they want to move up into the single family dream, then they can, because there is the housing stock. So the pro side of this is retail spending goes up. That is, they are bringing in their sales, their retail expenditure. City sales tax revenues then follow suit and go up proportionally. The major transportation investment that they are theoretically looking for in their stated preferences is already made. For example, the West Line is there. On the con side, the fourth bullet identifies the fact that we think that the feeder transportation system, however, is a little bit inadequate to support that at the moment. But there's currently, in our estimation, under 9% of the housing stock optimally located near retail, shopping, restaurants, and transit. And we looked at some of these maps in a previous presentation, and I think if we have pulled those up, or if we have them available, we might be able to look at those from a different presentation if you want to see those. But the other thing is that this demographic is sensitive to entry-level pricing. Commercial reinvestment and revitalization takes a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of private investment. So it would either mean catalytic investment on the city's side, but it certainly means that enhancing the attractiveness for this age group means there still is a lot of commercial revitalization that would need to take place. And it also does add to population and transportation impacts, just like all of this kind of development does. All right, so what would it look like to address the needs or the stated preferences of the 35 to 54s? So these are working families. Pros. The existing housing stock is what families with children are and still will be looking for in the future. I think I've mentioned this in the past. Every single survey we've done of local populations and workforces has shown that in the future, even the younger demographics who say they want to live in one of those third spaces in a micro unit and they just want to live next to Starbucks and, look at their iPhones, even they say in 5-10 years, when their lifestyle changes, when their life stage changes, they're going to be looking for this housing stock. Lakewood has this housing stock. So the pro is to enhancing attractiveness to this demographic is it also puts children in the schools and avoids school closures. Again, local retail spending increases. In the appendix of the draft report is a chart that identifies consumer expenditures data that is based on a national survey, and this is consistent even when we do local retail surveys. This age group has the highest spending of all the demographics, 35 to 54. The next highest is just the under 35s. So city sales tax revenues increase. This is the highest fiscal impact from these households. The other side is, I want to say, there really aren't too many cons about maintaining or enhancing the attractiveness of a community to any of these age groups. It's not like we're saying one age group is better than the other, or we don't want any of these people, or we don't want any of those people. That's not really what we're saying. But in thinking about what the quantifiable things are about this, so many have expressed an interest in the housing stock being located within walkability to transit and schools for their demands in 5 years. So those are the people who are currently in the 35 to 54-year-old bracket. Are they thinking in the future about where they want to be when their kids are out of school? Are they thinking about where they want to be simply in 5 years, even if their kids are in school? Nevertheless, that still creates this disconnect where only 9% of the city's housing stock is located in this area. That's a limited number of housing units, and in the numbers that we've calculated, which are in the executive summary, that is still a number of several thousand units that could be added in these proximities. I'm not making any kind of a case for a certain housing product type. That's more of a zoning issue. And that's more of a community issue, a neighborhood issue. But these folks are also sensitive to entry-level pricing and sensitive to pricing in general. And again, same as the under 35s, commercial reinvestment and revitalization takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money. Maintaining and enhancing attractiveness to the over 55s. I think in terms of this is a smaller list, but this ensures that residents who do live here have housing options in retirement to stay in Lakewood. I've heard lots of anecdotal stories about people saying they have to leave their home because there simply aren't the supportive services to deal with the problems they're facing. And that means things like rehabbing their houses, retrofitting their houses with railings and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, there is limited low maintenance housing stock. There is limited capacity for services for aged care. And there are really a lot of private partners that are needed to make this work, because I don't think that cities are generally the most effective at getting into this kind of a business, although facilitating it is another thing. The third path that the city could take is identifying resources. This is less a path and more of a means to getting to a path, but I did want to address it separately. So dedicating local resources, on one hand, the city maintains control over the resources it identifies. I think you're familiar with how CDBG and home dollars and federal HUD money works. That comes with heavy restrictions. In one of our previous sessions we had, we looked at what those restrictions are, and the income level restrictions and the tenure level restrictions on all of that make it very difficult for a community to flexibly address the issues it sees are really at the core of its problems, or its patterns and trends. The city decides how much or how little, and the city can contemplate how to use its strategic partnerships. On the other hand, if it's funding, the revenue has to come from somewhere, and that's a tough war to wage. Someone somewhere has to pay for it. Either it's a reallocation and a sacrifice and a compromise with other priorities, or it is a new funding stream, and that's a difficult thing to get into, primarily if it requires voter approval, and primarily in this state if it involves also control over local financing. Targeted regulation is another path that you can take down the resource path, the means toward a path, and this is a little bit vague, but intentionally vague. And I think and hope some of you will raise some of those questions in our discussion time about what this means and where this could go. But the city in regulatory mechanisms is laying stake to managing and limiting how that growth occurs. The city also can make goals in terms of requiring land uses and development to do certain things. The other side of that is simply the other side. It limits outcomes to the market. You're limited to market cycles. If development is occurring and you want to leverage development to do something, then that means you're theoretically tied to those patterns in the market and not able to really do what you want when you want to do it. And the other thing is regulation. Traditionally, from this is our perspective, deters market development. Regulation can function as a tax on development. It can function as a deterrent. That is, a lengthy review time, a lengthy development review process can deter development. Although in some places, like I was just in Toronto 2.5 weeks ago, and we were talking about many of these issues. And in Toronto, you can be thankful you're not up there, that you don't have the Ontario Municipal Board reviewing projects where developers anticipate at least 24 months to go through a development review process. So I want to say that to make you feel a little bit better about just where we are in the Denver metro area and what we're dealing with, not a statement about where Lakewood is, but as a consideration of those things that contribute to deterring the market. If you took that 24 or 36 month review process somewhere else that didn't have extremely high demand, you would likely thwart development most definitely. The hands-off approach is, of course, another direction that you can go. The continued pattern, the last 10 to 15 years have been an increase in the workforce and a constant kind of diminution of the available supply. Many of these things are really good patterns, and these are, as some people have stated, Lakewood is really a victim of its own success. In many ways, Denver is and has been a victim of its own success as well. And there are many cities like that around the country contending with these same issues. Business expansion continues to go upward, and that's a good thing. How long will that last? That's anybody's guess. In commuting has been going up because the ability of the new job holders to buy into or find housing in Lakewood has diminished, so that is an increased proportion of the new job holders having to commute in from somewhere else. And many of those are making decisions about living somewhere else because they want to live somewhere else. But many of them, or some of them, would probably want to live in Lakewood if they had an option to. So that means the loss of new worker household retail spending. That creates induced impacts. So by that, in the standard economic impact jargon, we're talking about a ripple effect of this spending. So job holders are spending their money on retail, and if they don't spend that money on retail, then the businesses begin to suffer and they struggle more, and so that ripples into either retail spending or not, and so that continues to cycle sort of downward. Transportation infrastructure impacts will increase, road O&M costs increase. I mentioned the businesses having increasing difficulty in recruiting and finding qualified labor. Existing resident spending goes down. So that's the other point about the age level differences in retail spending. After 55, every 10-year increment, people start spending less and less of their income and less money in absolute terms on retail. A lot of people spend in those ages more on experiential items. So trips, cruises, experiences, not shopping and all dining and everything like that. So that has a negative impact on city sales tax revenues. Aging in place, that again is kind of related to the last point. So what is the new one in here? Demand for home health care, social services, and lower maintenance housing increases. Some portion of current residents leave Lakewood seeking those services. There is a policy priority in there. There is in a lot of these there are policy priorities. How important are some of these things to all of you, and how important should it be to the city? Constrained supply and continued regional demand. This increases the gentrification pressures, and this you've already seen it on Colfax, just up against the Denver-Lakewood border, where there are increasing gentrification pressures, and you're getting housing stock scraped, and it's being replaced by a $700,000 townhome. Those are the kind of pressures that will begin to eat into the city even more as. If theoretically the housing supply remains constrained, that housing demand, if it remains constant, pushes pressure upward. So then the land becomes more valuable than the home, and so on, and you get the displacement gentrification. So housing prices escalate. City workforce already, police, fire, and teachers in Lakewood are increasingly priced out. There were some stats in the executive summary about police, fire, and teachers, their salaries, what they can afford, and how much that affordability gap has grown in the last just few years. So household spending on housing increases. Again, transportation spending and impacts go up, so their discretionary spending goes down. Quality of life goes down because they're not able to enjoy their life as much, and city sales tax revenues go down. All right, so I've made it through generally those kind of things that I want to get through. This is really where we want to take a step back and start to open it up into questions, because some of you have been writing some things down feverishly and madly as we've been going through, and I want to get to those things. So I'd like to orient us around maybe a problem statement. Should the city of Lakewood balance and allocate its resources so current residents receive the quality of services they desire while enhancing the city's relevancy and opportunities for Lakewood employers and employees? So this is in reflecting on the 5 core questions that we were given to address in the housing study. I think this summarizes in our minds maybe one of the questions at the core of what we're dealing with. The city's at a crossroads in some ways, and we've given our 2 cents on the 4 paths that can be taken, and it's not for us to decide which of those paths you should take. It's for all of you to decide which way to go. So
let me just ask a quick question, and maybe we should open this up to council for your first part. kind of did the quick update. And before we get too far down the road, see if there's any questions from council on that first part that was just laid out. Mr. Abel?
You refer to the 1 unit for every 3 jobs. What kind of jobs are we talking about there? Are these folks coming in to work at Burger King and Wendy's and can't afford to live in Lakewood? I didn't see any financial information tied to these figures.
What industries? So what industries?
So yeah,
Jobs.
sure. If a lot of the if a lot of folks are coming in to work in service industry, they're likely to have a hard time affording a place to live anywhere in the metro area.
Right.
So maybe that's why they're not moving into Denver. They hold a job here, but they live with mom and dad, or an aunt, or an uncle, or a brother, or
Absolutely.
so how do you, to say, that is a stark example, 3 units or 1 unit for every 3 jobs, but I think there could be more to it than just the surface.
There is, you are correct. There's more to it than meets the eye. And that was so it's on page 24 of the report. So between 2002 and 2014, public administration has grown by 3,700 jobs. Retail's grown by 2,300 jobs, but professional and technical services has grown by 2,100 jobs. We've got growth of healthcare and social assistance by 2,000 jobs. And the other one, which I never agree with on the NAICS categories, is called administrative support and waste management and remediation services. It's a catch-all in NAICS nomenclature for jobs that don't fit any other classification. Those have all grown by considerable numbers. And so take out the retail and
Under each of those other categories, there are entry-level minimum wage jobs. Education, there are daycare aides. So, professional services, would that include a carpenter's helper? And the thing is, job categories don't reflect income.
they do reflect income from the individual perspective. They all have average wages.
They all,
Those are quantifiable.
and they all have low wages and they all have high wages. If you're in the tech industry and you're keyboarding, I guess they still keyboard.
So
You get paid less than you do if you're writing the latest apps or programs. So the generalities is what concerns me.
I'm sorry, I misquoted some of these numbers. So healthcare and social assistance has increased by 6,900 jobs.
And healthcare has orderlies at the hospital, which
So-
are low-paid jobs.
It's difficult, and we never get this kind of detail. You can get average wage numbers, and you can get you can get aggregate wage numbers, and you can get an average wage in each of the industries. But you don't get you can get an establishment level distribution of what average wages are within these. And if we should go down this road of looking into the details of some of these and identifying maybe if it would be helpful to the discussion, we could identify the portion that are really in that home ownership band. Is that what I hear you saying?
Not necessarily. It doesn't have to be ownership. You're talking about units. I assume you're talking about rental units as well. So it just, to me, is, if you say the number of units per job,
Mm-hmm.
I think the kind of jobs that the other two people who don't have a housing, 1 out of 3 has a housing unit. The other 2 don't. So it could be the kind of jobs they have. Or there could be some other reason for it. You know, the suburbs, Lakewood is a suburb. Suburbs became suburbs because people didn't want to live in the city. So there are people that do want to live in Denver, and maybe they just work out here because that's where the job is.
So maybe you're saying it's okay that the ratio is 3 to 1.
I'm not saying it's okay, but there are other factors that could be involved that might make it less stark than it seems.
Should we identify some different numbers?
So, and may I think, because a lot of this, I certainly understand where Mr. Abel's going to get that better understanding. If we're looking at the policy part, right, the vibrancy of a community it's going to matter whether those folks who have the retail job and want to be able to afford to live in the city can, or they may not want to. So the generalization of is it all good or bad at the 3 to 1, I think is where it's at. But before we, I think, get into, can I ask a process question? I'll just go back to Charlie real quick and.
Oh, I have a few more things, but
Okay.
ask your process.
Okay. So where we're at right now with the core questions and starting to go to this next step, I've thought a lot about this, and we're missing key stakeholders, right? We're missing our housing authority. We're missing neighborhoods. We're missing a lot of that in this part of the discussion. So when you're a city that is actually an infill community and you have designated growth areas, wouldn't it seem to make more sense, and this is up to the council, absolutely, or if you've seen this, to bring those stakeholders together and say, this is what we have, what did you envision, realizing we still have to have a mix, and then what does the housing authority provide? And Ms. Nealon and I, we had a CEO roundtable of the largest employers in the city of Lakewood. And the 5 largest, to a point, one of the biggest problems they have is housing for their employees. And they're interested in sitting down with the city and trying to figure out how they could have a partnership when it comes to housing. So while we're looking at these high-level things, it really needs to be on the ground level, I think, before it really comes back to us to try to implement. And that includes, that's going to need stakeholders, that's going to need the citizens, that's going to need, something along those lines. And I don't know if you've seen that or how that's worked in other communities.
And that's part of what I meant with my question, is the affordability for some people is a lot different than affordability for others. So we need, before we launch into policy decisions, I think we need to know how we change that equation, how we make it affordable for all 3 of those workers to have a unit.
I do want to be
and,
clear, though.
and what that requires. I mean, that
Yeah, I'm not necessarily. We're not making this an affordable housing discussion. I mean, this is that can be a part of it, but it's not It's not primarily a discussion about affordability.
I don't
However, it's
think
a
you can
component.
separate
It's a
it.
component.
If you're talking about how many units per worker, I don't think you can separate the affordability component from the rest of the equation.
The part of the aspect of the analysis that this statement or that assessment points to is merely the supply, it's the quantity, not the price of it. And it's a statement on the difference of the historic growth pattern, which is more related to which is more along the lines of a 1-to-1 relationship, or at least a lower relationship. That is, as the city grew its employment base, it also grew its housing base. Now, there have always been people who have commuted in and out of the city. Don't get me wrong. The commuting data don't go back far enough for us to do that proper analysis. But when you look at some of those fundamentals, though, the city was growing more at a lower ratio of jobs to housing, which was that as the jobs grew, the city was able to accommodate those jobs without regard to the price point, without regard to so there is I do acknowledge what you're saying. I'm not denying that there is a component of this where if the city's growing by 1,900 retail jobs versus 6,900 healthcare jobs, and some of those are on the lower side, and whether or not they want to live here or not is another question. Of course, those are all kind of points of it. And if there is something about that we could get into, maybe to refine the numbers so that we can move forward on that point of the discussion, then we're certainly willing to do that.
I think when we're looking at our housing mix, we have to know what affordability is, because if we add nothing but high-end market rate apartments, for instance, that's going to limit the accessibility for some of those workers we're talking about. So I think that affordability and income is as important to the study as the actual inventory is when we're talking policy.
Ms. Nealon, you
And
want
I don't want to get into a
I
debate.
kind of want to help out a little bit here. When we initiated the housing study, we didn't have the foundation understanding amongst council and staff of what the whole city looks like. The purpose of EPS was to bring that and then start the policy discussion. The policy discussion in the past year has really changed across the metro area and for our seated council based on some of the actions that we've seen, either by our citizens or by an ask by any council person. So we had talked about doing a focus group or some public process. I would think what I'm hearing now is that the timing for that public process is a good timing because you have the foundation of information. A lot of information has been provided. That does go into affordability. As we go out, we would talk to different areas, and that affordability and that housing stock's going to look different for different parts of the city. And that's something what I'm hearing is you think that's important as you have the policy discussion, because what may look in the southwest part of our city may look different than in the northeast part of it. And so we could design a process that brings that back to you. I think what I asked Dave to do is start getting on some of the core feedback on some policy items that maybe you want to take off the table. From an economic development standpoint, we can incentivize things. We can incentivize in what we always call our purple areas that the comp plan identified as where growth should be happening. It preserved the existing neighborhoods, which is a big value statement that came out of the comp plan, but it said it had to be targeted in here. And then you start looking at the density in there. It sounds like there's been a kind of a lack of understanding in the comp plan process of what does density look like. We could work on that a little bit and say, here's what it could look like and here's how it supports some of our jobs, et cetera, like that. So we could go out and start linking these in a different way with the community, with our stakeholders, because as the mayor indicated, it was very interesting when we talked with our top employers. And it wasn't that they had a hard time finding employees. They had a hard time keeping the employees because the housing price is forcing people out of Lakewood and out of the metro area. And that becomes a big concern because now employers are thinking, do they stay here? So it's a big nested system. So if David can get through some of the policy discussion or get some feedbacks of what you like and don't like without getting to all that detail, because we can get to some of that, it starts helping the community understand here's the things that council would like to consider, and then they give you feedback on that.
And speaking of density, one of my other questions, I think the density figures give us kind of an illusion of what's really there. We are more dense in most places in the city, but when we brought in a bunch of property out in the Rooney Valley that's not yet developed, it lowered our density. So while the Rooney Valley is largely empty, so my apologies to Solterra, but while it's not heavily populated out there, the rest of the city has a different situation. So that again, you're absolutely right. It depends on what part of town we're talking about. So that general statements like this tend to cover or leave things more vague than they should be. Thank you.
So, and I think maybe page 108 is that the breakdown of the wages applied?
Yeah.
So I appreciate that, Ms. Nealon. I think we'll have to, I understand what you're saying, but I think if I could summarize what we've heard from the community is what is appropriate in the certain areas in the growth. And are we off where we kind of out of whack with that type? Not so much we don't need it, but what type and what's going in, and what do we do about ownership versus rental, affordable versus market, all those things. And I just feel like at this point we don't have enough of our stakeholders at the table. But let's continue through. There's a lot of questions related to this, so I'm going to start going down the line. Mr. Beta.
Thank you, Mayor. And tell me if you think I'm a little bit ahead of the game. We can come back to it. I wanted to address the core question that we have up there. Are we to that point yet?
You know what? We've been flowing with things, so go ahead.
All right. This is just a quick observation. I like your core question. I think that's something that we almost have to look at from the very beginning before we move into some of these other more difficult issues. But I would suggest to you that we might be missing one factor in this equation, and the factor that I think might be missing is what about the quality of life and the existing lifestyle that the current residents enjoy now. It seems to me that that needs to be included in this question. It's fine to talk about quality of services now and in the future, but it's more than just services. I believe it may also include quality of life. So I'm wondering if maybe we might want to think about adding that into this core question at some point.
I like that suggestion. Thank you.
Mr. Skilling?
I'm going to go off of what Nanette was saying earlier, and maybe this is my understanding of this. And one question I had is why this is a draft. I mean, I understand that Section 5 is left intentionally blank, the whole policy part. But I was under the understanding that a housing study would give us, as Nanette was talking about, we hadn't had it previously. Now you've got kind of the 30,000-foot view of what the city looks like. It's very comprehensive. You're on page 108. I mean, that's a good breakdown. There's lots of those tables throughout. There is a bit of editorializing throughout, but I can live with that. For instance, your last slide, 21, you've got a bunch of down arrows. If we continue the current trends, I noticed that all of those are bad. And I can live with that. But I kind of understood this study to be the study that we could all go to and look at for data sets so that we're not all up here making up our different, or not making up, but conveying our anecdotes that we have or our speculation, so that when we have a policy discussion and Mr. LeBure and I disagree on something, then we can go to this document and say, but look, I mean, we've got 110%, something, whatever the stat is.
Yeah.
That's what I understood this to be, so that later on, when we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting that we're all going to do, whether it's affordable housing or incentive programs for promoting ownership in the city, or any of these other issues, we can look at this and say, what's our ratio of ownership versus rental, those types of things, and we can make decisions, and we're all looking at the same data set, putting aside any editorializing, which I think we can identify, and those are fine, but you can take that out and just look at the raw data. So I kind of thought that's where we were going with this, and that the questions and the process of this, I guess, draft was just the draft in the sense of, is there more information? We'd like to see more stats. I'm not sure how many more stats you need, but if we wanted more stats, you would throw those in there. But I didn't think this was a policy document. This isn't a plan. This is just the thing that we really need for, to Charlie's point, and everybody on this council, we all know there's a lot of anecdotal stories. I mean, you ask 10 different people, they'll give you 10 different opinions about what the growth is like in the city, right? Well, we can look at this and we can make informed decisions for all of us. We might disagree, but we've got some data. So I just want to be clear that this is just, and maybe you can answer the question, that this is just a study, just a lot of data we can refer to. And tonight we're just talking about the data and stuff like that. Does that make sense?
The contract, when we were developing the contract, our hope was that we could get a toolbox of policy options for council to consider, because sometimes you don't know to even bring up a policy option. okay? So that's that purpose of that chapter 5, that missing chapter that we're going to put in there. If we don't want to go that far, I think David has presented some of those to us at staff level. The caution that I had is I do not want to lead any one of you up there on any of the policy questions. Remember, we've had that discussion back and forth of council. Does staff give you policy? Does council give us policy? How do we have that dialogue? And I would recommend we could do some workshops, much like we did policy and procedure, and you'd find it very interesting to start understanding the nesting of policies and outcomes that you can get. And it would make you think it's very nested and very complicated. It's not that you can't get through it, but it has a lot of dialogue that needs to happen in it. For example, do you incentivize housing to a targeted area? And how do you do that? And what's the outcome you get? I think in the comprehensive plan, they dealt with a lot of the quality of life issues in there. It's, do you want to invest? Invest in what? Is it in transportation? Is it in the incentive part of housing, affordable housing or market rate housing? And there's some downsides because you're trying to control the market. But all those things start coming into play, and you need to narrow it because otherwise it's going to stay in a large amorphous situation, and we don't know how to get you there. We've been struggling with that part of it. But our contract did have a policy component to it, hopefully targeted to Lakewood, and the reasonable policies was under the contract for David. Now, he spent a lot more time in the data compilation, so we've used our budget for that part of it to get this data to you.
Working for free.
Yeah.
Have been for many months.
Well, and I would say at that point, I would leave out. I mean, this is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. But I would leave out. Section 5. I think that dilutes I think that has a tendency to drive, as you're saying, that drives things. I would love this just to be a resource, a very valuable resource for data, and that the policy discussions. That's development dialogue. That's the things we've all been talking about. I think we all know what those issues are, and I appreciate this document without Section 5, but that would be my 2 cents on that.
Well, and I would just add to that, Mr. Skilling, though, while, yeah, that's development dialogue, but, and I think maybe we see this different, but there's a lot of programs that could help, like Live Denver. There's a lot of communities looking at over 10, 15, 20 years from now, what are those housing needs going to be? And to say it's just related to the development dialogue, I think it's deeper than that. It's saying, what do these communities want to see? Do they want to see ownership? What is our housing authority doing? Are they being outside the box? I know they have a limited amount to go and build. Should we be looking at policies to enhance their programs? Should we only be having our housing authority do rental, or should they be in some ownership? That's the way I looked at this part of this section, is to say, here's the raw data. This is great for development dialogue, but what, if any, policies should we look at, or just keep it the same and utilize, Metro West as our housing authority and just see what happens?
And I agree with all of that. I think it's just a process issue of what should this document be. Right. And I think if we add all that stuff, we could write a lot of chapters on everything that you just said, but if we just kept this somehow separate, that's all I'm saying. Keep this as a separate document so that we don't have everyone's different perceptions infiltrating that and somehow driving. Because you don't want that out of a study. You just want this to be a completely neutral document that we can look at. And I agree. We obviously need to come up with everything you just said. And development dialogue, I wasn't just leaving it at that. That's just the thing that's right in front of us that we're dealing with now. So when Planning Commission comes back to us with their recommendations on housing, that's going to help us formulate policies. We can all go to this document and be informed when we're talking about it and cite this study to make a case for whatever policy we want to implement. But I think we're saying the same thing. It's almost just I just want to keep I'll be hyperbolic, the sanctity of this study, and not have it infiltrated by any kind of editorial or prioritizing that maybe we don't need.
That's well said. So let's come back to that at the end and see, potentially that's where we go with the next steps. And so I'm going to go to Ms. Franks.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I'd be curious to see, and mainly I think this is more directed towards Nanette, if when we're working with our employers, current employers, and prospective folks who may be wanting to relocate their business here, I'd be wanting to see if we can find some type of an overlay for the kind of the cycle of employment. Right now we're in the IT field, we're at near 100% employment. That changes the landscape for those of us anyone who wants to be mobile, now's the time to be mobile. So any little thing if housing costs are high, you're ready to move. There's all these, because you're able to go somewhere and generally get more money and other things. So I'd be wondering if we're able to look at it through a lens of time, where what happens when that changes, and how do we need to kind of shape our policy so we strike the right balance and don't end up with a glut of something that then has nobody to be in there. So that would be the one thing. I would hope that we would kind of look at that. Also, I've been reading about kind of flexible spaces where they're designed in such a way that units can be flexed to fit different scenarios. And I think that we may want to be looking at some of those things and seeing if our employment community's interested in those types of stuff. Would that help them with that retention, but yet give the city sort of an avenue forward when those things need to change? And if you structure them right, they can kind of be through an entire life cycle if they're structured correctly. Also, and again, this is probably more for the stakeholder discussion, I'd be curious to see what businesses are looking for to remain in our city, if any of them are, on that. What are they needing? Because it may not just be housing. There may be other things. And also, what are we doing to attract other businesses, and what are the things that we're encountering, whether it be housing or other things, so we can look at it more holistically and develop a plan that addresses it a little more broadly than just a housing stock issue. So that's kind of a lot of things to throw out there. No real question in there, just a lot of food for thought.
And Ms. Nealon, do we have an economic development update with Jeffco EDC? And
We're looking at one in August, not only with Jeffco EDC, but with the chamber and our business improvement districts. Kind of say how do we all function together as a team? Yeah, I was going to answer that question. Some of the things that are going on, the dynamics is, if you look at your comp plan and your zoning, we're very limited at where businesses can locate and the density. I mean, the bigger businesses, when Amazon was coming in, we didn't put Lakewood on the map. There's no place that we could place Amazon. And we turned down a lot of opportunities to attract businesses because we just purely don't have the land space. If you look at our industrial area, you look at our Union Corridor, you look at 6th and Sheridan, to a smaller degree down at Hamden and Wadsworth, we just don't have even the demand. Well, one, we don't have the right campus set up like a tech center. We're in that market area. We don't have a demand out on the west side for office space. We found that out when we looked at the Rooney Valley area. So what we need is flex space, and that flex space goes into our industrial park area, and that's very limited. We have RTDs, one of our largest landholders in our industrial area. So to attract businesses, it's more the retention of our businesses, unless there's the Federal Center area was one area that had an economic opportunity there. What we do know about our businesses along the Union Corridor is they're very flexible. They work, they're in industries of the financial field or the tech field, and they're very flexible. So if the oil industry is booming, people transition over either from an IT or in our medical. We're seeing a lot of the skill sets transition so that businesses can remain flexible and they change their portfolio, whether they work with the Federal Center or they work with the private sector. So we have a very strong foundation along our Union Corridor on that. So I just wanted to let you know we've done some work on that, and you constantly are doing that research on that. But I think the thing that we learned with our top largest businesses, it was without a beat. everybody said, we're not having that harder time attracting employees. We're having a hard time keeping them. And it was singled out, housing. It wasn't even prompted. They told us that. And that was very eye-opener. And we said, good, we're doing a housing study. Can we come back to you and drill down deeper with the survey? And they all said, absolutely yes. So we can follow up that way.
And just quickly, I think the second and the third, the second was being able to create an environment that millennials wanted to work in. So some of our office space is a little bit older. So what does that look like to create those opportunities? And then ease of transportation if they can't live in the community to then get to the community. I'm speaking specifically about Denver West and one of our largest employers in Denver West. Ms. Vincent? Okay, you sure can. Thank you. Just keep your light on, please. Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. So first, I just want to say one of your initial questions was, does this fit the narrative does the narrative in this study fit what we're seeing up here? And I just wanted to answer that for me personally, that yes, everything in here fits very well with everything I hear in the community, everything I'm seeing in the community. Discussions, articles in the news, this all fits the narrative that we are growing in the Denver metro area and we don't have enough housing in Lakewood. I also just wanted to point out that I think it also fits very well with the information in our comprehensive plan, which makes very similar statements and even identifies the growth areas that are also identified as desirable places to grow here. So I think that's great that there's alignment there. And it's important that we have additional information there. And I think it also does really capture that growth is painful for the people who live here, and that we want to make sure that we're creating policies that respect and maintain the quality of life for everyone who currently lives here. But I think that it would be fine if we do separate out the policy section of this document from the data. But it is really important to me that we have the policy discussion because we currently, I see that we have significant issues that the people who work here can't afford to live here. And I know that this was kind of discussed a little bit already, but there is a lot of data about the average wage of people working in healthcare, construction, real estate, and what their housing costs would be, and the fact that basically unless you work for the utilities or the mining, oil and gas, you can't really afford to buy a house now in Lakewood. So, and I guess some people disagree with that statement, but it is right here on page 109. So anyway, my question is, as we get new housing, we are seeing a lot of higher end housing coming in. Have you seen any policies in other communities that incentivize having a mix of price ranges? So that are effective policies to accommodate different price ranges.
So that's one of the questions that I anticipated coming up. And yes, there are policies. I don't think they're great policies. Some of the people I work with around the country and even in Canada would disagree with me or not like me to say that publicly, but I don't think they're great policies. I think they go along with the line along the. I mean, these are. I should preface this. These are our professional perspectives on these things. These are not merely factual. This is sort of an opinion question.
That's fair.
Yes, fact. There are regulations. There's inclusionary zoning.
Mm-hmm.
There is inclusionary zoning that you can define on whatever income level you want. Davis, California, for example, established a middle income inclusionary zoning ordinance back in 2007. and they repealed it in 2008 when right after the recession hit, because it was simply too much. They also had an affordable income or a low income inclusionary zoning ordinance, which was a double whammy on development. Now, the theory, the idea was very interesting, because the average price of housing in Davis, being it's not landlocked. There's agriculture all around. It's a beautiful little community with, solid urban growth boundary that nobody's going to cross. But because of that, and because of the demand coming from Sacramento, from its workforce, was, housing prices just shot through the roof. Well, they wanted to make any new development in Davis have some component for a mix of incomes, not just the $700-900 million homes. They wanted workforce housing. So it was defined as a housing that would be affordable to, I believe it was 120 to 160% of the area median income, and their lower band was 80%, which is standard for inclusionary zoning ordinances. So that was the only ordinance in the entire country that I know of that targeted middle income housing, because most of the other communities that face these issues are facing issues that they've identified for primarily the low income housing, the low income needs. And they've documented and quantified what those numbers are. And so they've said, well, that's the one we want to target, so that's what we're going to do. Now, the question about, are they effective? Somebody else could stand up here and say, yes, they're effective, and you have to make them mandatory. And you have to make development do this, or else they're not going to do anything. And you'll get some people who will stand up here and say Montgomery County, Maryland, has the oldest program, and it's produced tens of thousands of units. But I want to tell you that those tens of thousands of units have also expired in their affordability and their deed restrictions, because when they first established that in 1972 or 4, it had a 1-year affordability requirement. So of course developers were like, yeah, sure, I'll provide 20% of my units as affordable for the first year, of course, because after a year, the deed restriction expires, I can just sell it off. So Montgomery County then incrementally stepped it down. And when you look at the graph of the production of their units over time in the last 30 years, all those 10,000s of units that they produced were all in the first 10 years, because they had a 1-year time limit on it. So when you take out Montgomery County, Maryland from the case studies, and you look at the other, I think the latest count is something like 800 programs in the U.S. 400 some municipalities have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. It's not an uncommon policy. It just might not be the best policy, because it's one of those regulations that often does deter development. And that's a theoretical position. That's not just a value judgment. That's a theoretical perspective, because it's a tax on development. We can talk about what the impacts are and so communities that choose that regulatory path are choosing it with the trade-offs in mind. And so I'm just here giving you my opinion, but if you want to disregard that, that's fine. It's your decision.
Thank you.
Okay, you're the councilman, I'm not.
Thank you. Okay, well, that's helpful. So in other words, there's not really any successful workforce housing programs.
No, I definitely wouldn't say that. No, absolutely
Okay.
not.
So
When
no,
you said mix of income, that's the first
Okay.
thing that comes to mind.
so there were no mix of income zoning policies.
That is the core of zoning
Okay.
policies.
Well, then could you give us some examples of successful workforce housing programs?
There are different varieties of successful workforce housing
Okay.
programs, and some of them are in really high-priced communities. Some of them are in communities where the workforce, like the healthcare industry, realizes that it's so important that they have workers that a hospital actually builds housing for its nurses. That has happened. And we could come up with a list of a lot of communities. I've worked with a lot of those communities that have done that. And up in every one of the mountain resorts, there are employee housing programs. That's a different game. We don't have that dynamic here in Lakewood. Okay, but that's one of those things, and those are successful because if they don't have housing for their workers, those people earning those levels of wages they cannot find those workers, and that's an exacerbation. That's an exaggeration as well, not an exacerbation. It's an exaggeration of the trends that are kind of currently going, that way and this way.
So I guess maybe I would love to know more about potential options that for our next discussion or when we bring the stakeholders together of workforce housing options, policies, programs that would work in Lakewood, just as options to discuss that are effective. And then I have one other question, and then I'll pass it on for now. The same question is about another priority in our community, I think, is that it's very painful to our community when we see something that people perceive as open space but it's vacant land. When that gets developed, that's a very painful emotional process for people. And whereas when they see redevelopment, it's more exciting to see something that was old and needs revitalization take place. So do you have successful incentive program examples to incentivize redevelopment instead of vacant land development?
Do you want to see those now?
Maybe just an example of the.
Great question. There are a number of communities that, and we've been working recently with San Antonio, and San Antonio has a lot of policies that they've recently tried. They've also done a lot of reorganization in their city governance structure, and they have identified targeted investment and reinvestment zones throughout their city. They use TIF very creatively, although they have put a moratorium on that while they're reassessing the current situation for their need for housing, specifically around workforce. So San Antonio is I didn't expect to have to think about San Antonio as an example for you guys, but yeah, there's some really helpful examples around the country on those kind of programs.
So that's kind of like, in addition to a growth area, you would have a redevelopment area identified, for example. Okay, that's interesting. And I do have one more question, just about I think that in our comprehensive plan, one of the major goals was to not only provide a mix of housing and at different income levels, but also to maintain the quality of life of our existing residents. And I think one of the primary ways was through establishing the growth areas so that you maintain those stable neighborhoods and then you have targeted areas of growth so that it's not as much impacting the stable neighborhoods. Are there other examples you've seen that can additional ways to help protect that quality of life but still allow for growth in other areas aside from what we're already doing?
Well, the answer is yes. There are certainly lots of case studies around, and there are varying degrees of efforts that can be made and put in place. Some of the minor things that I'm thinking about in terms of protecting the quality of life of existing residents. One policy case study we uncovered was in one of your sister cities in Australia, that has, and not that Australia is the only place that has established something like this, but had established in your sister, Sutherlandshire is the city, has established a resident parking permit system. So all residents have a parking permit, and parking on local streets is for residents, and if you're a non-resident, you pay. That is a benefit to local residents.
That might be very popular.
That is something that would benefit existing residents and the quality of life. It also mitigates road impacts. It generates a revenue stream. If I'm a visitor and I'm living in Denver, I live in Denver, and if I'm going to come over here and if I'm going to speak to you guys and have a conversation, I honestly don't mind paying for parking. I don't mind it, but that's just me.
Great. Okay. So I think maybe some additional examples of things like that would be really helpful at the next.
Okay.
That's a great example that I think, yeah, it's very interesting. So
Can
thank you.
Dana, we have put that list together,
Oh,
so we'll be ready for
well,
next
I
time.
just can't wait to see
But
it.
your feedback is gonna, from every council member, is gonna help us to say, did that list help or not? Because we had to cull a list down. I mean, you could be looking at every one of these categories. I don't know, David, we could have been looking at 50 policies in each one of those. So we tried to look at it Lakewood. We tried to think in your shoes and start putting it down and say, here's ones that at a staff level we think you would like. But the more you give us feedback, the more it helps us go, we're going to hit a conversation in stride in the next meeting. So
Great. Thank you.
And they call that code the curb, I think is what the term is for that now.
Is that right?
A lot of cities are starting to look at that, yeah.
Yeah.
Ms. Vincent?
A couple of things. One is, as an aside, I think one of the stakeholders we probably need to have is transportation there, because there's a lot of information here about our feeder systems which don't work, and where does that growth go. And transportation is also cars, not just, we have a tendency here just to look at the light rail, and it's more than that. As we start looking at things, I want to start looking at policies. We throw out the term here, keep some neighborhoods stable, but at the same time, there are neighborhoods who are trying to increase the stability of their neighborhoods, and that is probably from home ownership, less apartments, not all the affordable housing. And I think it's important that we need to keep that in our minds, because as that stability goes, so do the schools, so do the income levels, so do the shopping and the retail, all this stuff that these studies are saying. So I think it's important to look at that all the way through. That's so we need information on that, because we talked about the schools too. We have those schools that are in higher income neighborhoods that are very stable, and we have those that aren't, and they're making great progress, but we want to increase that.
So, Councilwoman, is there maybe something more specific or something that's missing in the study that we should add?
I think it's what I have to try to get my arms around is those high growth areas, and a lot of times that just means apartments. And I don't think that necessarily helps aid the stability of a community. And there have been some local neighborhood discussions about that sort of thing. We don't want apartments anymore because those people come in and out every 2, 3 years, 4 years. Their kids don't stay in the neighborhood. They don't know their neighbors. The school scores suffer, and then the income too can be impacted by that. Does that help? No?
It does help. I'm just not sure what kind of data we can put at that. You're getting at an issue of stability being defined by really a broad mix of family types, demographics, and income levels.
Correct.
And
ownership.
And
ownership. is a big piece of it.
We have been going through, as I think we talked about maybe in the first session, a massive apartment cycle in the country.
Correct.
And that's been unfortunate for the context of this discussion, I think, honestly, because that's in the backdrop. Yeah.
Of that. So we talk, because I think that sometimes up here as a council, we have a tendency to look at this neighborhood is very stable, and then this neighborhood over here is high density, yada, yada, yada. And that doesn't help Lakewood as a whole, I don't believe. So if we could get stuff around that'd be great.
Ms. Harrison?
Thank you. Great information. I really actually read the whole thing. Was totally boggled by all the numbers. So hats off to you who work in numbers all day long every day. I had questions about, I think Dana addressed a good share of them, but I also had questions specifically about the 55 plus crowd. Because there were comments in the study that talked about the fact that a lot of that, people were not moving out of their homes. They were still living in a home that probably was, you know, the 2-story, 4-bedroom home, and it's one person living there. Because when they bought it for $100,000, and now it's worth $450,000. And when they get ready to move, they're losing all that equity because they turn around and you know, have to buy something to replace it. Do you have any studies or ideas of how to create that turnover? Number one, and I'm going to come back to another question. Second question would be, one of the other things that, as I was knocking on doors during the election, there were an awful lot of people in neighborhoods, and probably a lot of us sitting here up on council, that if we had to buy our homes again at today's rates, we probably couldn't afford to do so. And that was the comment that a lot of the people, as I was knocking on doors, their concern is, if I leave this nest, I'm going to have to pay a lot more for my new nest, wherever that is, and lose that equity. That is why we're not seeing, I believe, the turnover in the neighborhoods with seniors, because of that very issue. Are there ways other cities have struggled with that issue and come up with maybe a way to turn over those homes?
Well, that's a really good question, and sometimes senior housing issues can be an entirely separate study. And I think, didn't Jefferson County just have a separate study completed?
Yeah,
I think there are two components to that, and turnover is one of them. But the issue that you just articulated anecdotally is common in all of these other cities. One of them is, again, in your sister city in Germany, in Stade, has several senior programs, and those are intended either to facilitate people staying in their homes, and handyman programs to help and to facilitate financing for people in need, to retrofit their homes with railings, with all the other kind of amenities that they might need as they get older. The inventory part of it and turnover of housing stock is a bit more of the human, or more of a sensitive topic, because some people don't want to leave their homes, and I don't blame them for not wanting to. But the problem there is housing stock, and what type of housing stock is available.
Some of them, I think, not all of them certainly, because I'm not ready to turn over my keys yet. But some of them, I think, would move if, number one, they could still be within Lakewood, where their support system is, both friends, family, neighbors, et cetera, doctors, et cetera, if they could do that. But when they have a 2-story home and want a ranch-style home, one of the things I wanted to see in the study is, do we have enough ranch-style homes to meet the need, potentially, of the senior population who might want a ranch-style home? I don't know if that's a wild question, but I was hoping we would have some of those kinds of answers. I don't know.
I think that's an answer that we can get to.
Cool.
Travis and I have worked on that a little
thought
bit.
maybe you had.
Yeah. What we recognize is we defined it not as ranch, but as patio homes.
Right.
And we just don't have the assemblage of property that can put that housing stock in place in Lakewood. And that's where it gets into, where's those opportunities to get patio homes in here? And there's very limited places in Lakewood to do that.
Well, and they tend to be, I believe, relatively expensive because they're new builds, and, again, trying to trade that equity for a new house, then I don't have the money to live on. So I think those are the issues that a senior population are looking at, and I don't know how to fix it.
Mr. LeBeer?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, me personally, I'd really like to see some policy recommendations. because I think there are a lot of things that we share on this council as values that I think it would be good to have some policies to back up some of those values. And I think there are some places where there are some differences, but where there are similarities, I think it would be helpful to have policies. I sort of wrote down just a couple. For example, I think there are places in the city where some of us think that redevelopment of businesses are really important. Obviously along Colfax and Sheridan and some of those major corridors. But there are other places in the city where that's not really a big issue. So, I think seeing some policies that are targeted and that give us some direction of where we should go in some parts and maybe some in others that are different would be helpful. Whereas, for example, preserving stable neighborhoods, as Sharon alluded to a little bit, Councilor Vincent, I think we all care about preserving our stable neighborhoods. I think Two Creeks or Iber or, these are no different than in Ward 4 or some of these other neighborhoods. So, where it would just be good if we could see some, looking at this from a value perspective and having a sense of what policies reinforce some of those values that we do share. And then, where there are differences, then we can sort of, I obviously have those discussions. And to Councilor Harrison's point, I don't think I can move currently. So affordability is something that's important to me, especially because my girlfriend wants to buy a home right now. So, and I'm living in a condo, so it's, I'm particularly interested in that. I think that's mostly what I have there. But local economy, building a local economy is something that, for me individually, is a value that I really care about. And I just want to add that because what that means to me is, and I've said this before, the way I've interacted with the city has changed because of some of our economic development that has occurred. So when I first moved here, there were virtually, no sidewalks in certain places. The light rail wasn't working or wasn't up and running. It's still working, but anyway, in certain places. And there weren't a whole lot of businesses near my home. Now things have changed. The light rail is there. We have new businesses that have come in. We have new art areas and murals and buildings and sidewalks and all those things has changed my interaction in a positive way for me. And so, one of the reasons I decided to be here is to encourage that sort of activity in certain places. And I think it's been a welcome thing in our part of town. So, so I'm looking for, policies that will help encourage that in our neck of the woods. Thanks.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. David, your document is very comprehensive. I just wanted to bring out a few things that kind of jumped out at me. Several times you mentioned that the data ended at 2015, and I would just like to say that we did a zoning rewrite in 2013, and since 2013 to 2018, there's been a great deal of issues around that rewrite of that zoning ordinance. So when this stops at 2015, it kind of leaves out a lot of real interesting things that have changed since 15. And I thought in here too that I saw that fewer people are leaving the city to go outside to work. Is that right? Didn't I read that someplace?
The out commuting is decreasing and the in commuting is increasing, right?
Okay, so then folks are finding homes here or finding jobs here that already live here. So the trend is kind of going in that direction, right?
You've got a combination of things going on. There were job holding residents that were either working in the city or working elsewhere that are now retired. And so much of the out commuting numbers one of the contributions to that data point is that the job holding local residents are not commuting out because they've retired. And so so there are a couple different patterns going on in looking at that number, and it can be a bit confusing. I understand that.
Plus, I think that a lot of seniors are getting part-time jobs, probably local anyway, so they're staying put. Okay. And again, I'd like to emphasize that there is a question that we should be asking, and when there are developments and build-out, there is a cost, a literal cost, and I don't mean just quality of life, although that's a piece of it, but the cost to providing services to for the local residents to have to subsidize some of this stuff. And we need to be sensitive to the costs that we are creating for the people who already live here by any build out. I very much agree with Adam when he said that we need to get community and residents to the table. We do. And when Councilman LaBeur said that he's ready to make policy, I'm not. This is the kind of a document that all of us need to be taking to our ward meetings, and maybe even up on our different newsletters that we have some surveys and ask our constituents where they are coming from with this as well. I feel very strongly about that. There's one place in here where it was talked about the city council to encourage folks maybe to leave their large homes. You know, you have one person living in a home with 3 or 4 bedrooms. Their spouse has died, and they would, you know, they're at a crossroads just in general. I'm having a hard time with city council getting in a position where we're trying to encourage people to leave their homes. Plus, I think we're giving mixed messages. There were several places in the document when it talked about creating services so that people could age in place. So that's an irony. You're saying, gee, you need to leave your home because it's so big. A big family can move there and we increase our density on one hand. And then on the other hand, we're saying, you know, we need to be looking at what kind of services need to be provided for people to age in place. That's a mixed message. Plus, I'm not sure it's the city's responsibility to get involved in either one of those.
Councilwoman, I've got a question, clarification. So if we've stated in here that we're giving direction that the city council should do this, I think we need to revise that. That as in city council should encourage people to leave their homes. I don't think we want to communicate that message at all.
I don't either.
So if it's in here, we need to find it and strike it and revise that, because I think what we want, I think if that does enter the territory of a value judgment, I think we need to take that out and neutralize it so that it is presenting the case that there is a trend going on. And how you deal with that is either you facilitate people who, if people want to leave their home, they can, and then you enter in the issue of the turnover and the affordability of that, or if people want to age in place, that's something else. And then whether or not city council gets involved in that is then your decision. So maybe we should clearly go through that and make sure that that's not really
Well, Councilwoman Harrison kind of broached that particular topic.
Okay.
And that's why I have concerns that we do not put that message out. It's not my place to tell somebody that they have to sell their house if they're 75 years old and they want to stay there. Plus, I don't know that it's our place to be providing services either. You know, people need to be thinking about their own old age and try to prepare for it, and their families need to be involved. But that's my value system. So I understand that. I couldn't agree with Sharon Moore when she was speaking out about the stability in some of our neighborhoods. We are putting pressure on existing neighborhoods, for instance, up and down the 13th Avenue corridor, and also the Union corridor, with a lot of apartment houses. Folks in apartment houses are, to be frank with you, they're more transient. They don't have the same buy-in to the community that somebody does if they own a home. And we need to also be preserving those neighborhoods up and down that 13th Avenue corridor of the folks that have residences and homes and have lived there for quite a while. In fact, I've asked the question, and frankly, I've never actually gotten an answer. From about Wadsworth to perhaps Kipling, from maybe 12th up to 16th, and like the Target build out, we've got so many apartments going in. At some point, you got to ask yourself, what is the number of apartments, individual apartments, versus the number of residences? And you reach a tipping point when you've got many, many more apartment houses. Those people that live in residences along that corridor are fighting for their life, for stability in their neighborhoods. And we need to be careful of the way that we suggest build-outs with high-density apartment houses continuing. That's my own take on that. Also, I know it keeps coming up that folks cannot work here and have residences here. It's too expensive. You know, I read the newspaper too, like everybody else, but we get mixed messages. I hear that Denver's a lot more expensive than Lakewood, you know, and some realtors will back that up with different stats. So to be honest with you, I'm not sure where all the information is coming from and whom to believe. I just don't want this document, and I very much appreciated your preface when you first started speaking, David. I don't want this document to justify increased density in those areas that we've defined as high density. We've got a comprehensive plan that has said along the 13th Avenue light rail and Belmar and the Union corridor, let's put all the density there. Well, I don't want this to justify that. We need to take a look at what we are doing to the existing areas, and have we learned nothing from what happened in the last election, and the fact that there are people that are looking at a growth initiative, and what the Union corridor document said in it. It literally said in the end of it, there was a statement that the problems along Union corridor and the transportation and the stresses that are being put on there are based on what we did with the rezoning rewrite in 2012, 2013, which is an honest statement. And we've got to be careful that we do not continue to put so much stress on corridors that are already struggling. I feel very strongly about that. Let's see here. When I was reading through this, it seemed like there were many issues, many values, many similarities between those that are under 35 and those older than 55. They see a lot of things the same. And that frankly makes sense. The under 35 crowd, they're probably renting more. They're not as interested in walking to school. They don't have children yet. But when they start to develop families, that's when they start looking at homes with playgrounds for their kids and things. And of course the over 55 crowd, they're kind of in that same mindset. But it occurs to me as well that a city cannot be all things to all people. And some of this needs to be market-driven. What is our role as a city? And I'm thinking that our role is really the way that we are zoning things and allowing growth to occur. And we as a council need to come to a consensus what our zoning ordinance is doing, what it has done, and learn from that rewrite. Also, I noticed that there were places in here where people were talking about having their kids, that they wanted to have them walk to school, and that's great. But now that we've got choice schools, that totally changes the picture on things. So there's a lot of things going on, and I'm struggling with things like what's happening on Independence across from Iber, with the Metro West Housing putting up, I think, 155 units. The impact on Iber, and also just south of that, there's going to be more townhomes. Independence doesn't even have sidewalks. And here we are thinking it's okay to do that. I've got a lot of concerns, but I don't want this to drive high density in that comprehensive plan that says that let's do it along the 13th Avenue corridor, folks, and along Union. We need to look at the stability of those residential homes.
Ms. Harrison, you had a follow-up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify my statement, Councilor Johnson. I didn't say that the city should develop programs and boot people out of their homes.
No,
I had no intention of that. What I would want to do is see if our housing stock meets the need of the people, and also if there's other programs in other cities to help those who want to move out, they could. I had no intention of booting Granny out of the house.
I did not take what your comment was, but the comment came, or the subject came up, and I have heard other people that suggest that you shouldn't have a big house, sell it to somebody else that has a family. So I think there has been conversation about that. I didn't take that you said that.
Mr. Roybal?
Thank you, Mayor. It took a while to read through this, Dave. Thank you so much. Raw data, boy, it just goes through your brain at 2 o'clock in the morning.
I'll try to take that as a compliment.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But one of the positive things that I was looking at is that maybe in consideration, when I constantly walk the neighborhood and I ask the questions, and I've been in my house 20 plus years. I'm still the newbie in the neighborhood. The question, to take in consideration, I was asking that maybe it might kind of filter through the study, is that when you have a couple that has gone through the cycle of life, the next generation, which are the kids, have moved in because they can't afford housing. And then their kids are there, and then you're talking second and third generation in the same house. And one of the positive things that I looked in the neighborhood, once you buy your house, you don't just buy your house, you buy the neighborhood. You buy into the neighborhood that goes around. Everything from the parks, the streets, the curbs, the gutters, the businesses. And a lot of times, I just wanted to put this out, like in business. You have a lot of small businesses in Lakewood that have developed there for years. And they may own their house in one side of Lakewood, and maybe about 5-10 blocks away, they have their business there. And so they do buy into the neighborhood. And I just wanted to make sure, kind of reach out and see if we can do we have any data, or can we get any information to kind of share with part of this data here about aging in place, obviously, and then the next generation taking over the house. So you might have 2 or 3 generations within 60 to 80 years living in the same house, you know, kind of just moving forward. And I'm looking at my neighbors next door, and they're working on the 3rd generation. And like I said, I'm the newbie in the neighborhood. But I wanted to reach out and take a look at, you know, if you can possibly give us any information or go about trying to figure out, would that be part of the housing study?
So, is there some information that we can gather that identifies intergenerational composition in households?
Something like that, yes.
Is that what would
Yeah,
help?
yes.
Or a number of people in a household?
Well, generational, you know. Let's say if you have a senior that is single, they're living, and then the kids move in, and then the grandkids kind of move in, and you know the changes are kind of moving. So I'm trying to figure out, how do we accommodate?
How do you facilitate that?
Yeah.
How do you accommodate it?
Yeah, or facilitate it to find out. And obviously, you know, you got 1, 2, 3 generations, and they go through the same cycle again, going through the elementary schools, walking to school or driving to school, the grocery stores, playing baseball, football, you know, going through all the parenting cycling. But just kind of wanted to reach out and see if there was any possible data, if we can get something that might help us, give us an idea about the housing and what the trends are, if they're staying in place or they're wanting to move into an assisted living, or in fact they might have done a reverse mortgage to stay in their house, or you know, things like that, to kind of give us an idea of the neighborhood.
We can certainly look for it, and it strikes me as something that would come from a survey of actual residents.
Yeah.
And I think in this study we opted for the workforce survey because the citizen survey had just been fielded, and it was perceived to have been too close on the heels of that to do a resident survey exclusively. There is such a thing as survey fatigue, but
right.
Anyway,
Well,
it strikes me as something there. And
Our AAA area aging through Dr. Cog, they might have some of those numbers, and we can see Jefferson County just completed something we can try to drill down. Mm-hmm. So before I go to the second round of questions, I want to offer 2 things. One is on the second round, maybe clarifying anything else that you'd like to see or more data that you'd like to see. The second part would be, there's been a suggestion to then bring forth chapters 1 through 4, just bring that forward. Then I would suggest creating a committee, and a committee that could then start to look at the policy type issues, could look at other stakeholders to bring in, and have these conversations as a committee moving forward that can then engage and keep this conversation going, because clearly it's going to take a lot longer. It's going to also depend on where things go with the development dialogue, but the importance of bringing together many of our stakeholders, I think, needs to happen before formal recommendations are sent forward. So with that, I'll go to our next round. Ms. Franks.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. Kind of speaking along the same lines that Mayor Paul was, just on the policy and the stakeholders. Information that is going to be critical for me for decision-making purposes is capacity analysis and capacity planning, and what that looks like from an investment perspective. And I'm just going to give a few examples. I mean everything from the capacity of current rec centers, capacity of city administrative staff and other staff, park capacity, also our nonprofits that provide services. We're going to, any kind of growth impacts them. And then we start talking about critical things like water, the electrical grid, Our schools, I know that we had a frightening number on the number of seats that Lakewood High School could permit. I think it was based on either water or fire or something, but it was a scary number that community could have to incorporate. Fire, sewer, all of those things. This seems to me like I'm bereft of information that shows the stress we're going to put on not only city services, but district level services and amenities that we all enjoy. And so that's going to be part of the equation too when we're trying to balance that whole quality of life piece. And I'd want those stakeholders all at the table to tell us, what is that going to take to put new water lines in there? Is that going to stress existing water lines? What's that infrastructure all going to cost us if we add on X number versus Y number versus Z number? And some of those, as we've seen from a recent bond initiative, some of those don't pass. So then what happens? Does everything degrade? So those are going to be key decision making for me, those in capacity analysis, planning, and investments, and what stakeholders come to the table to tell us about what their planning looks like, and do they even have the budget for some of the stress that we're going to put on that infrastructure.
Yes, sir.
Clarification, Councilwoman. Is that something you want this study to do?
Part of the whole, when we broaden it, I was mainly speaking to Nanette, so part of what needs to be, because when we start talking policy, so I was trying to look past you and didn't do a very good job, but she's literally right off your shoulder. So no, that was more for Nanette.
Because
Thanks.
I was seeing a scope of services this big.
Yes.
I was getting afraid, very afraid.
Ms. Gutwein.
Okay, thank you. So I think you already added incentivizing ownership policies. That's already taken care of. Okay. And then also looking at examples of ways that we can encourage or incentivize senior housing. That's already getting incorporated. Okay. Great. And then the other main thing I wanted to say kind of to our council is that a while ago we had talked about looking at development fees, and we've been looking at park fees, but one of the ones that we haven't re-examined is our school fees. And I think that, I'm not sure when will we be, do we have is that?
So we were going to have a broader fee discussion, and I don't know. We'll have to get back to you.
That's okay. That's fine. So I just want to make sure that we do that. And I think that some people have mentioned this before, and that I think it's great that we're going to have the stakeholders. But one thing this has really highlighted to me is that the different at different times in our life, we need different things. We prioritize different things. And I don't want to see that frankly, the group that I come from that has young kids and that are in our schools left out of the conversation. And I want to make sure that we have to find some kind of balance as we're increasing all of our fees and our park fees so that we can also increase our school fees. Otherwise, we could just, exacerbate the cost of living issue here in Lakewood. And I think I'm just going to leave it at that for right now. Thank you.
Mr. LeBeer?
I just want to clarify my previous statements. Councilor Johnson mentioned that about community input, and I'm all for more community input and more stakeholders. I'm just saying as it relates to policy, and my desire to see some policy recommendations is geared towards where there are values that are shared and that we're in the direction we're moving. For example, this might not be related to this housing study, but business development. I knocked 8,000 doors last year, and I don't think I met one person in that entire time who said they didn't want to see some new businesses, a restaurant, a coffee shop on Colfax. So to me, and another example is stable neighborhoods. Okay, we want stable neighborhoods in certain areas. I think that's well established. Well, what does that look like? Does that mean we need to lower taxes? Do we need to raise something? Do we need to put a gate in front of the street so nobody else can move in? I mean, that's the kind of questions I have. How do we keep stable neighborhoods? Is it just keeping zoning R1, you know, and certain, you know, whatever it is? I don't know. I'm not the policy expert, but so that's what I'm looking for. So just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks.
Mr. Skilling?
To take this back from a study perspective and to give a real life example of the things that we're all dealing with, we've talked in generalities as we often do, not that that's always a bad thing, but let's just take this back to what's really happening right now in the city. And if we take a collection of ideas from all of the counselors, where there was a mention of patio homes a moment ago, that we need more patio homes, or at least that would be a goal, especially if people are downsizing. We mentioned the ranch and the seniors and aging in place. Well, if we come up with a policy and we look at this data and we ask you to provide more data and we talk more about providing patio homes, how does that actually relate to the real world and what's actually happening? Because as I see it, I've got some examples of places where patio homes currently would have been given the red carpet, and that people would have been very excited to see a field that there's nothing built there now, but they would have welcomed patio homes. And instead, the reality is developers are A, not interested in ownership, B, certainly not interested in patio homes, which leaves us with C, which is more market rate apartments, which we've heard echoed throughout this council. That's the reality. So we can sit up here and talk about our lofty ideals, which is what we do, and that's good. But how exactly do we take that and put it into practice? Because I've got a real world example of where patio homes and development in my ward of all places would have actually been welcomed, which I know you're not as familiar with Lakewood politics, but that says something when Ward 4 wants to develop something. So that's what I struggle with. It's like we could come up with all these ideas and we should build more patio homes and this, but then on the ground, we've got developers that won't do it. So my suggestion, because I'm not one to just whine and then not offer any solutions, is that we have some, and maybe it's part of the committee process, but we need some real examples, probably isn't the right word, but let's get into the way that the developers are thinking. As members of the community, what is it that would attract them to build those patio homes rather than market rate apartments? What's the difference? What kind of incentives could we offer? And is that a pie in the sky idea? Are there no amount of incentives that we could possibly offer to change their minds and get them on an ownership track? I'm not having a construction defect conversation tonight, but if we're going to really talk about, oh, we need this kind of housing stock, we need that kind of housing stock, let's talk about what reality is. What can we actually achieve in this city? And how do we achieve it? So if it's incentives, do we need to understand what it costs a developer to build a certain type of product? I couldn't tell you offhand right now what the current per square footage cost is to build a certain type of housing stock, but I'll bet somebody does. And then compare that with patio homes, because we're using just that as the example. How do we bridge the gap? How much money is that going to take? And do we have the will then to create some kind of incentive program to actually bridge that gap? So until we start talking about what the realities are, I don't think we can really move forward with anybody's, and they're all great ideas. Everybody's got, and to Jacob's point, Councilman Levere's point, we are all on the same page in a lot of ways. We have differences up here on certain things, and in certain parts of the city, that's what creates that rift. But I really want to talk about specifics, and I know, Nanette has some great ideas on that, but if I was going to offer a suggestion, it would be, let's talk reality. How do we get that builder to build an ownership opportunity, and how do we get them to build those patio homes rather than the market rate apartments?
And I would just say to that, I think this committee, absolutely, you're going to want developers as part of this. It's going to have to be everybody to understand. And if you can figure out incentives, that's great, but maybe it just comes down to zoning, and you have to do certain kinds of zoning as well. So everybody needs it to be at the table to have the conversation and better understand, and that's what I would envision. Mr. Abel? Sorry.
I would agree with that. The incentive we have is letting people develop prime properties in Lakewood. That's a privilege. And I think that instead of holding that carrot out there, we allow them to meet the community's vision of who we are. And I agree with Mr. Skilling. How in the world does high-end market apartments help, which is our predominant project in this city lately, how does that help teachers and firefighters and police officers buy or get into an affordable situation, whether it's purchase or ownership opportunity or a rental? It's just not there. So we need to direct the direction of the market toward things that are good for our community as well as the developer's pocketbook. And I think this study might help us do that.
Mr. Schwartz, last word.
From me. I was gonna say thank you for the suggestion, because that was actually a part of our original scope of services. Additional services were focus groups with key stakeholder industries. And one thing that we offer as a firm is our interaction with both the public and the private sector. We work with the private sector, and we work with the public sector, and we work at the intersection. I can't tell you how many focus groups or stakeholder meetings I've facilitated with a council or with a subcommittee of a council, an ad hoc committee, whatever it is, and developers in the room asking just those questions you've asked. Why are you not building the product we need? Why are you building this? I know some of the answers already about the development side, but let's just leave. I'm not gonna offer that up, because I think that if the conversation happens, which I hope it does, I think those things need to come from them.
Mr. Abel?
If you're still willing to work for free, we'd like to have you on that committee.
Second that.
So
If I have time, I will.
So let me wrap this up, and here's what I would envision. So essentially, we need to start with a committee of council and maybe a preliminary meeting to talk about the scope and what they envision for that body to look like, and then come back, and then we can get it approved by council, and they can get to work. And that would be stakeholders, kind of a vision of where they want to go, a time frame, and then we'd of course need to figure out maybe what staff would need to be a part of that, as well as if you want to continue to donate your time, or if we need to write another check. So does that sound like an okay way to go? And we could preliminarily hopefully have something in the next couple weeks that would identify who the members want to be, and could then, how about this? Who wants to be on it? I can bring that back next week, and then we could, if that's approved, then we can go forward with the scope of what we want to try to do. And in that meantime, we can get information from all the council on what they think that scope should look like.
I'm learning to be specific in these study sessions, very specific. So let's get specific. You just talked about committee. Let's talk about it now. I like that idea.
Okay. Who wants to be on the committee?
Ramey.
So we have Ramey from 1. Hold on.
We all want to be on it.
Ward 2, who's on Ward 2? Okay, Ms. Vincent. Ward 3. Mr. Roybal, Ward 4. Ms. Franks, Ward 5. Ms. Harrison. And since everything's going to come back as far as votes go, I'm gonna want to be a part of this. There you go.
So then we're going to leave open spots for how would the stakeholders work? How would staff work?
Staff, stakeholders, community members, private industry, our housing authority, seniors. We got to identify the stakeholders.
Okay. So when's the first meeting? I'm the idea man. That's
Okay, those meetings will take place on Monday nights immediately following city council meetings.
Thank you, Sharon.
But we still need to bring the ad hoc to a vote. So if that's acceptable, let's do that. And then after the first meeting, we'll come back with a scope of, and in the meantime, please, if you think of a stakeholder or somebody that you think should be a part of that, let's start to collect that. Cool? All right. Can we feed that to you, Ms. Nealon? Is that cool?
Yes, you can. And I just want to make sure then it's also, the other item that I heard is that David can finalize his report without the policy chapter in it, and so we can get that closed out.
Is that the direction I was hearing? So addressing what you heard tonight and then wrapping that up, and then this group will start to take on the next round. So that'll be, Mr. Goldstein, I think that would need to be for April 9th to have the ad hoc approved.
We'll see if we can add it to the agenda.
Oh, certainly. Okay. Thank you. All right, public comment on that. This group in here knows the rules. Mr. Furman, you are the only one who's indicated a wish to speak. Good evening. Welcome. Thanks for hanging.
Oh, it's good. It's good to hear. I actually mostly came because of usually both in council meetings and study sessions, the people you hear from are very much anti-growth in every way possible, and they'll move the goalpost in any way they see fit to make sure that their agenda to stop all growth, even in some cases, I think, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, someone suggesting that you need to reduce the population. I can tell you from someone who was born and raised here, has essentially been a part of this community my whole life. My parents live here, my sister lives here. As somebody who knows the community well, growth is okay by a lot of us. People my age group who don't have time to come down here often understand that growth is a part of this community. And there are ways in which this growth can benefit us. This is a fantastic study. You combine it with your Union Corridor Transportation Plan, and you can begin to see overlay where the people commuting in happens to coincide with the same time period you begin to see some of your traffic problems arise. I mean, so I think the information you guys have is fantastic in front of you. I just hope that you remember the people who come and talk to you are often the people who have the most time because they don't have children at home. They aren't getting home at 6 and 7 at night from work. Oftentimes they're the people who are, you know, they're invested in the community, but don't forget, don't allow this sort of disproportionate ownership they like to put out about how this is their community. It's all of our community. None of us own it. We all happen to be just citizens here. So I just want to make sure that there was a voice that occasionally said there are parts of growth that will work for us and they're going to be beneficial. And so fighting it at all costs is going to be fighting a huge number of your citizens. So that's the main reason I came down. But it was a good talk.
Thank you. Anybody else? Paul? Good evening.
Evening, Council. Paul Ditson, President, Iber Neighborhood Association. I had prepared something to state, but after hearing the dialogue, I'm really very encouraged that conversation is beginning to converge. So I'm not going to go through the several minutes that I had prepared. I was going to underscore what I had submitted earlier today in that email and touch on a couple other items, but I don't think it's really necessary now. So I did want to recognize the good work that the staff and Ms. Hodgson and Ms. Nealon and Mr. Schwartz have done on this. And I've outlined some of what I think may be the deficiencies in the study. And we'll see where it goes from there. And we'd be very happy to also be involved as a stakeholder. So thank you.
I imagine you probably will be a part of that. Just thinking. All right, anybody else? All right. Mr. Bartel, come on down. Good evening.
Good evening, Mayor and the City Council. 7 short words. If we build it, they will come. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you. All right. Field of Dreams. Here we come. City of Dreams. Okay. Thank you very much. And next item up tonight is municipal funding, and I have our finance director / city treasurer, Mr. Larry Dorr, who really enjoys talking about this sort of stuff. And to set the background of where this came from, this was a priority that came out of our planning retreat. And so this is an overview, and it'll be up to council as to where, if anywhere, this discussion goes. Good evening.
Thank you, Mayor, members of City Council. Once again, Larry Dorr, City of Lakewood Finance Director and City Treasurer. And yes, you've got to have a real passion for this subject for sure, and you know that I do. And so I'll be looking forward to talking about it tonight. To restate what Mayor Paul just touched on at Council's planning session, there's an interest in talking about municipal funding, which of course can take on many different dimensions and go in a lot of different directions as a result at Council's orientation earlier, I should say last month. I almost said earlier this month, but it's April now. I handed out some information at the orientation about the history of Taxpayers' Bill of Rights and the state constitution and how it's impacted the city. Just kind of a fact paper, gave a little background on that. So that might have been one dimension. And then second dimension, tonight, I'm just going to get into some different areas. But one, you know, it has been since 2006 since the words certificates of participation were used in these chambers. That was the last time the city issued certificates of participation, and those were in refinancing old COPs, and people use the expression COPs. So I'm going to do a little refresher of that, talk a little bit about bonds and the history of those across the city, and then relate that to infrastructure needs and opportunities across Lakewood. And I'll try to do that as fast as I can and do it in as simple a way as possible, and then just seek some direction. And we'll get specific. We can talk about, you know, next steps and things we might be able to do. First, I wanted to just talk a little bit about a resource that I think could be useful to you, Mayor and members of City Council. This is an elected officials guide, and it reads to debt issuance. It's about 75 pages. It goes beyond that. It really talks about capital planning and other things. And this is authored by the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada. And I'll put this in your council office. And it's a really it's a really good academic resource. Go straight to the glossary if you hear a term that I'm using or something that might not be understandable. Go straight to the glossary and then look up what the term might be, and it'll be a good resource for you. I'll leave it in your office, and you can have a peek at that. Let me just say that chapter 1 in the book is preparing a capital plan, and of course the public is well aware, or excuse me, the council is well aware, and I think the public could be in some quarters, which is we have a capital improvement and preservation plan that is prepared each year by staff and presented to mayor and council at the annual budget study session, and of course as a part of the annual budget. It's very intense. It's gets a lot of attention by all of you, and certainly a lot of effort goes into the city's capital plan. And related to sort of municipal bonds 101, any interest in taking such an initiative forward would first begin with what are the needs of the community, what are the infrastructure needs, and so on and so forth. So that's sort of chapter 1, which I found interesting. Another thing in here that is a consideration is sort of like fixed interest rates versus variable interest rates. You know, large communities will issue municipal debt with variable interest rates. That's more and more common. We have not done that in the history of Lakewood, but there's a place for it. And communities who've done that have done well over the last decade because interest rates have remained very, very low. Also want to just bring in some new information too. With federal tax reform, municipal interest rates are not as good as they once were. And that's because the tax bracket, the highest tax bracket is now lower. And so municipal bonds that have no taxable interest are a little less appealing to investors. So that's a little bit of a change. And then lastly, I just want to draw your attention to long-term bonds versus short-term. You know, the city has been involved in long-term issues, 20 years. Those are a little more risky and bear a little bit more interest. Shorter term, less risk, less interest. And all of this is really just a backdrop to kind of get you loose as you think about some of the facility needs and some of the infrastructure needs of the community. And again, all of it comes back to really things that I've taken out of this resource for elected officials. One of the things about municipal bonds is, of course, they're going to require voter approval, except in the case of enterprises. So the city has 4 enterprises. It's a water utility, sewer utility, it's stormwater management utility, and our golf enterprise. All of those enterprises can issue bonds with a long-term commitment just with the approval of city council. Okay, and that's allowed under the Lakewood Charter as well. Without a vote, those bonds can be issued to further the enterprise and its customers. Tabor does require a vote for general bonds, general obligation bonds, or even revenue bonds. That's the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. It's a section of the state constitution. So two different dimensions. One of the other basics from the resource is, and we would need this, you would naturally understand this as you think of our own budget and your experience with that, but a new repayment revenue would be needed. And as people often say, you often hear this expression around the community, the school district is going for a bond. Well, what that typically means is not just for a bond, but also some sort of revenue increase or a tax increase, typically a property tax increase for the schools, in order to repay those borrowings, which might build schools, buildings, fields, all of those kinds of things. And then in addition, one difference could be also a Tabor exemption for the city of Lakewood. I reported to Budget and Audit Committee in January that I estimate the Tabor refund for this year, which you'll be seeing later on this summer in the budget study sessions, is between $8 and $9 million. And so that as well is somewhat, could be a voter-approved revenue stream to issue bonds or to finance projects on a pay-as-you-go basis. Now, we often hear this expression COPs, and I use that a lot, and you see that printed in the city's budget. What it really means is certificates of participation or a lease purchase. And the city council just at its last meeting authorized a lease purchase for sustainability and related to our energy performance contract. Repayments are subject to annual appropriation. With bonds, they're not subject to annual appropriations. Those the funds have to be dispersed. They're a promise that is made by the voters, and so hence they can get repaid, except for enterprises, again with annual appropriation. Interest rates and terms, same as bonds, tax exempt, variable or fixed interest rates, COPs or bonds, same thing. A voter approval is not required. Obviously, we just had this lease purchase approved by council just at its last meeting. However, revenue repayment stream is needed if we're going to have the ability to do any sort of substantial municipal funding. Some examples of this, and these are hypothetical, I just pulled these out of the sky, and you can see that I've got one mil of property tax would generate $2 million a year in revenue. If that was bonded against 15 years, probably 4% for 15 years, that would develop $22 million in proceeds for some slew of capital projects or for transportation, recreation, a myriad things I'll show you in a moment. Or in sales tax, 0.1% would develop $3 million a year, again bonded, and you can do this math in your head. It's obviously half again as large, $33 million in projects. That was done in Lakewood early last decade and in the late 90s. And we're just on the last number of years of paying off those COPs, which will be next decade. Tabor exemption, revenue could be retained for a bond or COP issue. So now just to transition just a little bit into infrastructure needs and opportunities. I spoke earlier that I really wanted to focus on open space, parks, and recreation. I'll give a little bit of a flavor for that. Stormwater management, and then I've lumped together roadways, sidewalks, and the city's bicycle system. So first, let me just touch on Imagine Lakewood. And I think that many of you, I know that's quite a graphic, many of you have seen this and were a part of this study, which is the 2017 Community Resources Master Plan. This was a 12-month project and involved 2,200 surveys from Lakewood residents on what they were interested in, what they valued, and really this is sort of the guiding principles for our Community Resources Department. And let me just give you a few of the key fundamentals that came from the process. One was quality programs. That was toward the top. Take care of current facilities was in there. New facilities to meet the needs of the community. And then stewardship of our resources as a community. One of the requests were these, I got some new vocabulary myself in this process, and one of the requests was for more spray grounds. I had to say that pretty carefully. But they're apparently they're awesome and popular as well with the youngsters, and I think you all know where this particular one is. And you know, we in our park system have the ability to put in many of these, and they're very, very popular. On the other end of the spectrum is our Morse Park pool that was built in the 1950s, and much like Glennon Heights, it needs some attention, and that's going to take quite a bit of funding to get that park pool away from the baby splash pool that people have seen, and it has to be protected by a lifeguard and all that, to more of the spray ground, type of environment. Earlier, I think you saw that spray ground was at Carmody Park. And you've seen probably this 2014 Carmody Park Master Plan and Project Summary. And if you look at this, and if you know Carmody Park, you'll see that just phase 1 of 5 phases, just phase 1 is complete. We don't yet have the nature play, and we don't have the path that sort of makes that kidney shape, if I can call it that, around the park. So we have needs for park development not only at Carmody Park, but Two Creeks Park, Whitlock Park, and Wright Park, and there are probably some others, but I think you can sort of imagine each of those and think things could be done there. And so park development is a big part of that. I heard a little discussion with the earlier presenter about the aging population, and I'll tell you, our aging population, our retirees in the community are very, very active in many different ways across the community. We have 4,235 pass holders, which are age 55 plus, and that is growing. And when I say pass holders, that doesn't just mean recreation centers. That also means places like Bear Creek Lake Park and other passes that we have. We have 1,200 Silver Sneakers participants and greater and increasing demand at our recreation centers. Somebody told me if we could build any classroom space at any of the rec centers, they would be filled up instantly, as I did a little research on this. So we have a need for center expansion at our existing centers, and some of them have been expanded. And then, of course, if you know our Star Center over on West Colfax at Wadsworth, somewhere in that, just northwest of the intersection, you know that we have a need for renovation at the Star Center. So we have to address, in some regard, those facilities and infrastructure needs for our aging population. In 2010, the city added capacity for its Head Start program, and I know that many of you know and understand the need for Head Start. This isn't shrinking in our community, and last time this was added, this is over $1 million facility, and of course we continue to have waiting lists. So we would certainly in our infrastructure have the opportunity to meet and expand needs in that area. All of these relate back to municipal funding, of course. And then in transportation, our roadways, sidewalks, and bicycle system, you know all of these places. I'll give you a minute just to skim down the list, but you understand our traffic needs for automobiles in various intersections and interchanges. You know about our citizen sidewalk request, which of course is a function of transportation, right? We have logged 190 requests from citizens, and that, of course, there are many more that staff and our city engineer's office could add to that list, but it's over $100 million in need. And then lastly, we're going to have a report with the city's bicycle system master plan, and you'll probably see some big dollars, but that report is pending. So these infrastructure needs, they're large. They are difficult to do on a pay-as-you-go basis. It just takes many, many years to accumulate the money to then invest into some of the projects. And there's a concept also related in the academics called intergenerational equity. And that is when it takes 10 years to save up or 20 years to save up for a project, and then the project is built, and then that takes a few more years to build. The first generation paid the taxes, they were saved in the treasurer's coffers, and then later the project was built, and that generation of people, which changes, they enjoy the project, versus in municipal funding or COPs, bonds, however you want to put that, the taxes that are collected go to pay the borrowings or the lease purchase and by the people who are enjoying the facilities across the community. So in our stormwater management utility, and you're going to hear a lot more about this on April 16th, we have, of course, major needs across the community, and I know council has still studied that very carefully, but now in the context of municipal funding, we need to, one of the things, not just addressing our 18 major drainage ways, but in the future, we will need to replace existing facilities. We have 100 projects that are needed in the books, and right at the moment, we have a pay-as-you-go plan, but we have the opportunity to accelerate that with any kind of borrowing. And Mr. Hutchison, our Public Works Director, will have more details on that in a coming study session in just 2 weeks. And so with that, I know it's a little bit later in the evening, and I know that was a quick presentation on a broad subject, but I do want to note that that's added on to my fact paper on Tabor and how that's impacted the city over the years and some of the many changes. Citizens of Lakewood have voted on taxpayer bill of rights matters 4 times in our community, and so I wanted to provide some data on that. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I'll be glad to answer any questions and accept your direction.
Yep. So I appreciate that. I know that this is never popular. It's not a popular subject to talk about, but I think I've heard from a lot of people in all throughout the community, different areas, different things that they want to see. So I'm happy to have this. To put it in perspective, how much have we, with this potential 8 to 9 million, does that put us around 35 or 40 million in total Tabor refunds?
It'll be right at 25, Mayor.
With the 9?
With the 9, yes, sir.
So City and County of Denver just spent 43 million on their brand new state-of-the-art rec center. So that puts it in. If we give between 8 and 9 million back, and this is redundant for some of you on the dais, that's double what we receive a year from the state of Colorado and the federal government for transportation in the city of Lakewood. We receive about $4 million. My question is, if you looked at municipal bonding, without a debruce, because currently we refund through our property taxes. So if you did a municipal bonding, that would be potentially coming from your property taxes, correct?
Could be from property taxes, sales taxes,
so you can pledge, okay.
Or fees as well. That's been done and is also part of the reference as well.
Okay, so you have a few different. And what's our total debt load as far as COPs? How much do we have left to pay?
Let's see. Of course, that's enumerated in detail in the budget itself, but I think
roughly.
I think the Civic Center is through 2020, and the Recreation Certificates of Participation through 2022, and I think they're onward of about $3 million a year in debt service. Give you an idea.
What's our capacity on COPs?
Well, we do have a legal debt limit, but that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Really, the capacity is driven by how much money do we have every year as a city to make repayments. And I think you would all be aware that all of the city's income is programmed for police services, for public works, street maintenance, park maintenance, and all those kinds of things. So,
but when we look at total city debt, what is the percent? I mean, it's very small.
It's
right?
extremely small. Yeah.
Like less than 10%, less than 5%.
Less than 10%. Yeah. Probably less than 5% of our total budget is spent on debt payments per year.
So what we have left in debt services has to do with COPs, and then what else is out there? Anything?
We have some very small, relatively small, lease purchases for things like our police department evidence storage facility. We have some smaller equipment leases, but we don't have any may I say, generational sized debt payments beyond that.
Right. And then I guess my last one would just be a comment, and that is when you look at the Tabor revenues, and the cool thing is it's a vote of the people, so they have the opportunity to weigh in and say yes or no. But when you're looking at a community that's based on retail, new retail that you generate, depending upon where you're at in the city, because the Mills has a little bit of an exemption, right? But any of those new dollars coming in essentially could just be flowing right back out via a refund.
Yeah. Yes, that's correct. So, for example, when the Amazon Corporation licensed with the city, 1/3 of the city's sales tax is exempt from Tabor, but 2/3 is subject to Tabor. So, as that retail base expands, correct, it will increase the amount of the refund. Now, to the extent that somebody would have been shopping in Denver or elsewhere, then there is some kind of revenue recaptured there. It's a very difficult thing to quantify.
Mr. Skilling?
I was going to request that we each be given one of those books. I don't want to have to go in the office. So that shouldn't be a big ask, is it? We each get one of those books. And then we each get a copy of your slides from tonight, the Municipal 101, because I don't think that made it into the packet.
Very good.
That is all.
Okay. Mr. Abel?
There's a big difference between Tabor and bonding. For one thing, if you do a municipal bond issue and you ask the voters for approval, it includes a detaborizing of that particular amount. And can you tell me how much our Tabor overage will be in the year 2021?
Yeah, well, that's impossible to know.
Thank you.
You could just kindly tell me all the
if
revenues.
if we stake all of our future mitigation plan, growth mitigation plans on Tabor, we could be disappointed and come up without a Tabor refund overage some years.
It should be noted that we have had a Tabor refund 6 straight years. So
I understand that's 6 straight years. What happened in 2011?
We were debruced.
No, we weren't debruced as a community, but there wasn't a refund that particular year.
That's right. So my point is, depending on Tabor is not a sure bet. If we want to take care of business, then a revenue bond would provide a certain source of income or revenue stream to take care of the capital needs. Is that correct?
More certain. It wouldn't be absolutely certain.
Well, nothing's certain in this life, but yes, more certain. The COPs for the City Civic Center complex will be retired in 2 years?
At the end of 2020. Mm-hmm.
End of 2020. And you said there was another one that would be retired shortly after that?
Exactly 2 years after.
And that would be the recreation centers?
Correct.
And I believe that we're approaching the 25th year soon, the Belmar Urban Renewal Project, when their sales tax will go back to the same rate as the rest of the city. Is that correct? Was that 5 years away?
I think that's 2026.
2026, so 8 years away. Okay. So in 8 years, there's another source of a revenue injection that'll be coming. How do we get that would be subject to Tabor as well, wouldn't it? Or is Belmar Tabor exempt?
Belmar has a 1% sales tax. It's subject to Tabor. When the waiver expires, I think it's 2026, the sales tax rate will go from 1% to 3%. That increase of 2%, half of that will be limited by Tabor and depending on the circumstances, could be refunded, and the other half will be exempt.
And there's a question about municipal funding that I've been trying to figure out. When we raised the stormwater fee a few years back, I believe we were going to use that to leverage bonds to take care of some stormwater improvements. Is that correct?
That's not my recollection. I would defer to Jay Hutchison.
I've asked Jay about it, and he said that was it to start with, but apparently there's something in the market that has caused that not to happen.
I'm not aware of that. I haven't seen that in the academics at all, and certainly council could authorize bonds to be issued at any time for those purposes within the stormwater utility.
Okay. But we're not now using that increase to leverage bonds.
Correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Ms. Johnson. Oh, never mind. Hopefully I didn't skip you last time. Mr. LeBaire.
Do you have an idea of what we collect revenue-wise for stormwater drainage on an annual basis?
I believe it's in the $5 million range. We can look that up, but I think that probably gives you a good idea.
4.5-ish. Yeah.
Okay. And you said the Tabor refund this year could be anywhere from 8-9 million.
Correct.
Is that possible? It could go up to 10.
It's possible. Yep.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about the ratchet effect and how that affects Tabor? Or is that too long of a discussion?
It's that's definitely some detail. I could just say it this way. Even if the city's revenues don't grow at all, or if there's a recession, the city still could have to refund revenues due to this function of Tabor, whereby if the city's revenues are above the limit year after year after year, even though there's some allowed growth, the city could still have to make those refunds each year. So that's certainly in effect. So in other words, if the city's revenues grew 3% this year and Tabor allowed 3%, there still could be a refund of $8 to $10 million. So that's just one of the functions of it. Yeah, I don't know that it necessarily impacts, this debt issuance or municipal funding concept in the big picture, but it's definitely a source of funding that's there for either pay-as-you-go or bonding.
Do you know how much we collect in property tax off the top of your head?
The total property tax is probably in the $9.5 million range, but we've been having Tabor refunds effectuated through the property tax mill levy. So after Tabor, property tax bills have been reduced probably 2/3 to 3/4 for the community, which is commercial property owners and residential property owners.
Now, as we refund this money, what does that look like? Who gets the money? Who do we refund it to? Do you print a check and you mail it to people's houses, or what does that look like?
Thankfully, no. We don't do that. But as is commonly done, and the Department of Local Affairs and state government have allowed for, and for years other governments have refunded under Tabor through the property tax. So if you're a homeowner or a commercial property owner, you have a property tax bill. Part of that property tax bill includes the Lakewood mill levy assessment, which is recertified each year by City Council at year end during the budget process. And rather than assess, for example, a mill levy of 4.7 mils, Council has instituted a temporary rebate and decreased that mill levy to in the low 2s, somewhere in there, in order to make that refund complete. So if you're a visitor to the city, you wouldn't receive any of that refund, even though you might have paid those taxes. If you're a renter in the community, you don't receive a rebate of those taxes. It's only commercial and residential property owners who receive those refunds. And so it's imperfect, no doubt, but the idea is that the money is back into the taxpayers' hands generally and back into the community and not at City Hall government. So we think that it's certainly the most efficient and inexpensive way to return those monies to the taxpayers. But clearly, if a homeowner was in the city one year and not in the city the next year, they moved away, or vice versa, then they might receive the benefit or the disadvantage of that.
See, I wanted to ask because I never got my check, so I was just wondering.
Yeah. No, it's a paperless finance office as much as possible.
Okay.
Postage free as well.
Got it. And then I guess one other question. So it's not just the residents that are paying, that are getting this money back to their property taxes. It's also, you said businesses, so it's like that's Walmart, Target.
Yep.
What does the breakdown look like of that? Who gets, where does it go? And the reason I'm asking, because I'm curious if we're paying, I'm wondering if we're giving our money to Target or Walmart that might have went to building, things that people as you mentioned, what the community wants, parks, rec centers, things like that.
So one of the things I understand about Lakewood is that there's an amendment to the state constitution called the Gallagher Amendment, and Lakewood plays into that really, really well. About 55% of the property taxes that the city collects, 55 cents of every property tax dollar that the city collects comes from commercial. Okay, so that's Walmart and Colorado Mills and all the property owning businesses in the community. And then 45% from residential. By the way, if you own an apartment complex and you have a property tax bill, you pay that. It's residential, and then so that's about the ratio. About 45 cents of every dollar comes from residents, 55 cents from commercial property owners, and obviously renters in the community. They don't pay property tax directly. So hopefully that gives you an idea.
It does. Thanks for answering a lot of my questions. I mean, all the questions I had. I know I had a lot. Thanks.
Ms. Gutwein.
Thank you. Just one question. Could you tell me more about what it would look like to reserve the Tabor bond to pay either COP or a bond, or I'm sorry, the Tabor refund to pay back a COP or a revenue bond?
So let's see. That's really a lot of accounting at the end of the day, which we do. But the city would, if there was an election and it was voted up that the city would retain those revenues, the city would not only retain the 2017 Tabor refund, but potentially future refunds. And then revenues that would be retained would increase, and those funds could be used either with council approval for certificates of participation, or there could be a separate vote for general obligation bonds, or there could be a council approved bond within the enterprises of the city, including stormwater management or golf or those enterprises. So so that's really just a management of the funds and what they're dedicated to and directed for by city council.
So we're clearly talking in theoretical terms at this point, but if we were to put a Tabor refund issue on the ballot and the voters passed it and said we could retain that fund, and then council decided to issue a COP, that would be done based on the funds that we got. How would we do that? Like, to Charlie's or Councilor Abel's question, sorry about that. Thank you. About the uncertainty and not knowing how much each year it's going to be, what would be the best practice of trying to use those funds?
Sure.
Accounting for that uncertainty.
We have a little bit of that in the academics, but fortunately the market takes care of that at the end of the day, and it wouldn't really surprise you. Mr. Abel makes a good point around the idea that it's difficult to predict what the Tabor refund or the source of those monies might be over the next certainly over the next 10 to 20 years. That's a very valid point. And often, if you've had the experience of borrowing money for a mortgage, you know that the bank wants to know your credit rating. They want to know all about your job. How long have you been on your job? Are you self-employed? Do you have a salary? Who do you work for? How long have you been there? What's your level of education? And the bond market banks are the exact same way. If the city were to use its Tabor refund to borrow money to do capital projects, you can guarantee that very sophisticated banks and investors would very, very carefully and very cautiously look at that source of income and would loan money based on their estimates, because of course they're at the greatest risk of getting repaid. So they want to be very conservative about what that refund is and what it might be, and on and on. But clearly it would be a good sign to that investment community if it was voter approved, because that's a very strong statement from the public that they want to see these things happen, and so on and so forth. So they would do some sensitivity analysis, best case scenario, worst case scenario, middle of the road, and in a very technical way, and then back that into what's the community trying to accomplish, and how long might that be repaid for, and on and on. The most conservative thing to do being pay as you go each year, just salting that money away, and then each year doing things. But it's difficult to do a destination recreation center or a major expansion of a recreation center on a pay as you go type basis.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So then I'm just gonna can I just jump into the direction to staff might take, or no?
Well, can we just keep with some questions?
Yes.
For now. Mr. Haley had a question. And then we can.
I do. You mentioned the refund of property tax and Walmart in the same breath. If I remember right, a few years back, Representative Claire Levy was trying to change the way Walmart does business because they put all of their property into a land trust and it's not taxable by the state. Are you aware of that?
Not at all. I can tell you that Walmart is paying substantial property taxes that we're collecting.
To the city?
The city of Lakewood, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Very sure of that.
So when it comes to kind of the best idea, I think there's a lot of different things. And the best idea may be just to do nothing. But you look at like a Denver, and we're not even close, but a $900 million bond package. I mean, just to put that in perspective, just to get us around $200 million, we'd have to nearly double our property taxes. Is that accurate?
Probably in that range, and dedicate all of it to such a repayment, which is, a lot of the property taxes being used for our programs as a city in our general fund. So, yeah, but Denver obviously is
much
substantially
different. We're
larger.
way different, but I'm just in comparison. When I had first found out, just to get to that number, what that would do was shocking. And so as we look to our financial future, we are very fortunate that we're on top, but we've been, we've had great financial management for a long time. Lake was desirable. There's a lot of pluses. Colorado Mills may not come back to what it was, right? And we're going to start to see, and who knows how long this boom is going to last. But when we look at trying to be strategic, and if it comes down to raising fees or things like that, even if we do nothing and we get to a point where we're raising fees, some of those fees will just go right back through Tabor and be refunded. Is that accurate?
100% of fees are, except for enterprises, are limited by Tabor. And given that the city has been over its limit for a number of years, any new fee would be, except for an enterprise, would be refunded.
How about increase in fee?
Oh, and an increase in fee as well. Yeah.
Mr. Skilling, question?
Other than the direction that we all receive, one of those books, what are the other types of direction that you would be looking for? Just give me, and I'm kind of struggling with what that would, I could give you all sorts of different types of direction. I'm not sure that's what you're looking for. So can you give me a better idea of what types of direction you're looking for?
Well, I'll also make sure that the PowerPoint slides get out to everybody in addition.
Indeed.
Got that note
Indeed.
here. You know, it could really run the entire spectrum. I don't have any preconceived idea of what that direction might be. It might be more communication, more data, more study. It might be work up a resolution. It could be, you know, can we see a quarterly financial update? It could be anything. I really have no idea what your next direction might be. And I have to confess, I wasn't necessarily at council's planning retreat and really have a real clear vision of the context of municipal funding and what next steps might be. So I would look to you all as to really what next steps or direction there might be.
Well, and I appreciate that, and there probably is the spectrum. But I was just wondering, since this was your presentation, whether when you put in there questions, discussion, I get that, but then direction to staff, I just didn't know if there was something in particular that you were looking for, and if we could narrow down the spectrum, then that's right. But if it's the whole spectrum, that's fine too. I just wanted clarity on that.
I certainly think staff just wants to just the facts, ma'am, and go with that. And you know, this is new to everyone on this body, and we haven't been in this conversation in the 10, 12, however long I've been on council. So, I mean, I think folks might have some ideas. Are we still on questions? I have Mr. Abel, Ms. Johnson, Mr. LeBeer, Ms. Gutwein. Okay. Ms. Johnson, questions?
I would just like to request that next time when we have a discussion like this, if you could put your PowerPoint on our packet. I had no idea what we were going to be talking about tonight. It would be helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Abel?
So we have, last I saw, $120 million in drainage projects alone, and that stretches back over 20 years. So, and we have streets to improve, sidewalk needs everywhere, bicycle paths, you name it, we need it. How do we pay for that? Well, you're the financial expert.
It's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for sure. Other communities are paying for those things in the academics, you know, by having Tabor exemptions and financing bonds and certificates of participation. You see it in communities across the Front Range. You see it in Jefferson County. They're taking a bite out of it. I don't know if they're doing everything they need or even everything that they want or everything that they need, but they're advancing.
My point is, with Tabor, we would be piecemealing it every year according to what was left over. So a revenue bond is really the only way to target such a large expense for some time out. Not saying that a Tabor exemption wouldn't add a little bit to the pie every year, but I don't see how we get there with just a Tabor exemption. And if we don't get there, how do we continue to grow without taking care of the mess we already have? So I'm getting past questions.
No, but I mean, it's good dialogue, and that's, you know, so in 2020, 2022, essentially we're debt servicing how much a year? 6 million?
Somewhere in that neighborhood. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's real dollars on a payback, right?
It is, yeah.
I mean, that's good payback. I mean, that gets you some projects, and I don't know what that would look like, but if you could get to that point or get yourself bridged to that point where you're then have that money that you're already servicing, and then you can pledge that going forth to service the rest of it. So,
but if you do, man,
if
you do that with COPs, you don't get the Tabor break.
Right.
And
so here's a couple things. You know, for some folks, I know they want to see things fast. Some want to see it slow. We've created 2 committees now. But again, I think this is a citizens type deal, you know, a blue ribbon, but more of a finance for the long run. What does the future hold for the next 10, 15, 20 years? And how do we do that? So, you know, I don't know if that starts with the Budget and Audit Committee to take a look and maybe bring back some recommendations. I'm open. There's some folks I think that want to make suggestions. Ms. Gutwein?
Let's do another committee. So, joking aside, I think that it's really exciting that we're having this conversation because there are a lot of needs in our community and we hear a lot about it. Just recently, we talked about the Route Street Bridge and the angst around the Union Corridor, the bike paths, the sidewalks, park acquisition opportunities, all of the things that you mentioned. And I, for one, would love to see these things happen in my lifetime, or at least some of them happen in my lifetime. So I think this is really good to have a serious conversation about this. And I think that Councilor Abel brings up a really good point about if we want to actually be able to do all of them, the Tabor refund isn't going to get us there. But if we, you know, I think some of this is also a political conversation and a community conversation as, you know, well, how much is our community willing to do, or what do they want to pay for? And you know, in terms of what, in reality, what will actually pass and what does our community want to do. So because of that, I think that it does make sense to have another committee and engage our community and talk about, you know, we've heard from you that you want these things, but do you want them enough that you want to pay for them? Or is it just something that you kind of would maybe someday like to see? And if you do, how do you want that to look? Do you want it to be a Tabor refund? Do you want to go for everything and really see some real change and improvements, and go for the revenue bond like Councilor Abel was bringing up? So that's what I would really love to see is have some concrete projects that our community can look at. You did a great job of providing that, and just put together that list, get our community together and see what's possible. And in terms of time frame, I think it would be great. You know, there's a deadline here to get this on the November ballot. So I would like to do this sooner than later.
Okay, so I'm going to do something. So we have a public comment on this, and I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to put somebody on the spot. So I'm going to ask Mr. Wickman to come down. He was a part of our previous tax discussions, I think, and I'm just curious how those were put together, whether that was through a committee or ward committees, or how that happened with the sales tax and those different things. So I'm going to open public comment, and if you want to come down and if you recollect how those happened, we'd welcome your input. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Anybody else wish to speak, or anybody else have a recollection of pre-2007 and committees that the city put together to deal with? We had a tax increase. We debruced. We did, I think, a couple different things. All right. I'll close public comment. So, Mr. LeBeer, go ahead.
Do you have any cities in Jefferson County debruced?
I think all of the cities have except Littleton, but we could check on that. But
in Jefferson County, because I think they're refunding about 40.
And Jefferson County itself, county government, yeah.
Okay. And Denver and Aurora, have they debruced?
Yes. Aurora still has some revenues, I believe, limited by Tabor, but they have some nuances similar to Lakewood. But
I knew the Denver one. I don't know why I asked that. But
I don't know how many dozens of cities it's gotten to, but it's many dozens.
what is the average return on like this year? What would be the average return on some, or like cut on somebody's property tax, like for me, for example? 'Cause I'm still looking for my check.
Well, it's based on the, keep looking. It's based on the value of the property, obviously. You know, the city's property tax, I'll just say it this way. The city's property tax on an individual property is about 5% of the total bill. So y'all just hopefully thought of your own property tax bills, and a common one in Lakewood is probably $1,500 to $2,000. So if you take 5% of that, that's the city's portion of your total property tax bill. Okay? So whether it's $1 million home or a $90,000 home, you understand your property tax bill probably. So 5% of that, and then whatever that number is, 2/3 of that has been the refund, or would be the check that you're still waiting for, if that helps.
Yeah, so it's
if it's a $1,500 property tax bill, the city's portion of that, 5%, and then 2/3 of that would be the refund. And so oftentimes many people, when they talk about that hurt, yeah,
So
it's like a really nice dinner, I think I heard up on the dais, but many people use different words around that to say that if a Tabor exemption is passed, it amounts to a tax increase because people will pay more tax. Other people on the other side of the argument will say it's not a tax rate increase. They're right too, because the property tax mill levy rate is still the same, and a rate increase is not voter approved. So I say that just from the perspective that there are 2 points of view on such a thing, and both are correct at the end of the day.
Are we now, as far as Colorado Mills goes, this is a little bit off topic, but are we looking at less revenue on sales tax from Colorado Mills potentially?
That remains to be seen. People, we first of all, we don't quite have we've only collected, we are collecting the February and taxes and reconciling them just at the end of March. So we haven't had quite a full month of activity with all of the stores open. There's still some major retailers that have not yet reopened at the mills. They will draw people that will shop in other stores at the mills. So we just don't know at this point. It's going to take a little bit of time. Certainly we're collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars in sales taxes each month from the mills. So it remains to be seen if shoppers will return and what it will be like when other stores open. So either way, that's not a part of the Tabor conversation. Doesn't impact the Tabor number in any way because it's completely exempt, that whole geography.
And got another point or question that I'm going to forget now. Let's see. All right, I guess I'll skip it since I'm losing my train of thought.
Mr. Skilling?
So to Councilor Gutwein's point about the committee. So at some point, I think that the committee would be a good idea. As we've seen with some of these other issues, I think a committee is probably the way to go on some of these things. On this one, though, I would respectfully disagree that a committee would be the way to go on this at this point. Mainly because I don't think we've figured out yet what we want to spend the money, or that's probably the wrong way to put it. We haven't really figured out what the priorities are that we need the funding for. So my fear would be that the committee would usurp this council's priorities, and it would find a way to fund things, but then we don't know exactly what we're funding. So I don't know which way, whether we're the horse or the cart. But I think at this, I think at this point, we need to figure out what we want to fund. We want to figure out what that bill looks like and then figure out how to fund it. And maybe there's a lot of these different funding. Once I get my book, we can figure out what funding mechanisms we need. We've had a lot of talk about whether it's park acquisition, infrastructure needs. There's a lot of these things. I think we need to have a clearer plan of where we're going and then have a committee with how to get there. And if we decide as a council, look, we think the options are, to deep roost, to do the bond, whatever it is, then maybe at that point, it's the committee where we form the committee to find a way to pay for these things. And again, I'm shooting from the hip, but just my reaction to a committee at this point, I don't know what the committee would do. I I think the committee would figure out ways of, okay, here's different ways we can finance things. But at that point, I think then it stops, because I don't want the committee to take the next step, which is, okay, we found the funding, now let's find a way to spend it. And I think that's this body's priority, is to figure out how to spend it. And that would just be my 2 cents. Obviously, I don't mean any disrespect to the idea, but that would be my 2 cents on that.
I do have thicker skin than that at this point. Thank you.
I think it's an appropriate qualifier when I
Yeah,
was
that's fair.
responding.
Thank you. So maybe just to expand on that a little bit, I believe that's the way that Denver did their last bond issue, is that they put together a community committee and they had a list of known projects that they wanted to get done, and the community committee actually was part of selecting very specific projects that they wanted to get done. I think that is a really great way to do it, rather than having our council determine it, because this is the community's money. And while we are here to represent the community, I think the more engaged they are from the beginning, the better off that we'll be in meeting their needs. I think that we also are already have a very good understanding of what our needs are in all of these different areas. We just went through the Imagine Lakewood plan. That was an intensive process that highlighted the community's desires and goals. We just went through a transportation study in the Union Corridor that highlighted specific projects. We have a bike master plan that's coming up. So we have so many plans already, and ranked projects already, and identified projects that have price tags along with them. We've been doing that for years. So now I think we are already at the point where the community could look at a list and say, you know what, we do want to use this money for this project, this project, this project. Or they may say, actually, no, we don't want to do any of this. So I don't see any harm in engaging the community. At this point, we have identified projects, and we're about to put back $8 or $9 million. That's enough to do the Route Street Bridge, right there, more than enough, based on the estimate that we were given. And again, I think that that engaging the community early and often in an issue like this that can be controversial is the better way to go than leaving it up to this body.
Do you want to respond?
Just briefly, I'm not suggesting that we don't engage the community. I think we can, we all do that. So I don't think that those ideas are in conflict. I certainly think we should engage the community for sure. But I don't think that then means that we should have a committee. So I think there's just that disconnect. I think certainly engaging the community. I disagree that I don't think, I'm at least not clear in what that ranking is and what those, I agree with you wholeheartedly that there's a long list of projects there. I don't have clarity though on which ones this council has decided to go forward with and thereby fund. So if we throw it out to the community, I think that's what we're here to do. But I think once we do that, that is also going to bring in a whole nother set of priorities, which may be in line with the ones that we discussed at the retreat. They may not be in line. And we may be back at square one with that. And that was my point just about the committee. I just didn't think we were there yet with the prioritizing of actual projects.
I guess that would maybe be the purpose of the committee, is to help prioritize those projects, which we could do as an entire body. The reason I suggested that is that it seems that when we have long issues that are going to require a lot of discussion, it has become the practice that we have a committee and engage our stakeholders so that they can bring back a recommendation to the entire body. It's going to be a long and drawn out discussion. And I just have to go to the bathroom, so I'm not trying to be rude to leave.
Okay, thank you. For a quick follow-up on that dialogue, Mr. Dorr, I mean, it's fair to say that each department has a list.
It's fair to say certainly that our Public Works and Community Resources Department, they tend to be our project departments, and that's where I organize much of the information for my PowerPoint tonight. So yes, I think they do have a fairly good lists. You do have to appreciate that many of these projects, they're complicated in nature in terms of what would the design be and construction cost estimates, particularly when you get into transportation like Route Street Bridge. I mean, you need to have very qualified engineers spend lots of time in design and organization to understand what a project may cost. In fact, that alone would take months. So gotta be careful with that. Versus a playground reconstruction that's $75,000, they can get that within 5% or thereabouts. So I think you would appreciate that.
Ms. Harrison?
I just wanted to, we talked about the effect of the Tabor quote-unquote refund on individuals. Could you clarify what the effect would be for businesses, because businesses pay a larger portion of property tax?
They do, yeah. So for every dollar in value, a commercial property pays 4 times the amount of property tax. So if I have a $100,000 office condominium and you have a $100,000 residential condominium, I would pay more than 4 times the amount of tax that you would pay. So, yeah. Yep.
So effectively that means that I'm going to get as a business 4 times increase in my taxation.
Your tax rate would not go up, but the amount of tax
the amount
you
that
would
I
pay
would.
Right.
Yes.
Just want to make sure I get that correct.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mr. Roybal.
Mr. Dorr, I got a couple questions for you, a couple hypotheticals. One of them being tax refund to the individual home. Sometimes the county gives, when you're of age, they give you a 50% discount. Would that also apply to the city? For example, if the county only charges you half a rate of your taxation for your property, or the case being if you were 100% disabled with the veteran and the state paid your tax for the property, would the individuals get the tax or would the state get the tax, or how does that work?
Fortunately, all property tax is administered by the county assessor, and the county assessor's office has that very carefully organized. And I can say confidently that any exemption that would be in place for any population would remain in place outside of this Tabor refund not being made. So, yeah, I have to confess I don't know the exact details of each of those programs, but they would be preserved.
Then my next question is churches or nonprofits. Churches, they are tax exempt, so they wouldn't get any of the Tabor refund through the property tax, I take it?
Correct, yes. They are property tax exempt, and so they haven't paid anything in. They wouldn't get any refund either.
Okay, and then like the stormwater fee, they would get charged for stormwater fee. Let's say if we were to refund Tabor back through the stormwater fee, which was done before, would they get a certain percentage refund back through the stormwater fee back to, for example, the church?
Now, I believe in the 1 year. Excuse me, there were 2 years that refund was done via Tabor. The tax exempt properties did not receive a rebate for Tabor refund, just because of the pure fact they didn't pay any tax in, and we wanted to concentrate as a community to the taxpayers.
Even if it was the stormwater fee, not a tax, it was a fee, and it was rebated back, but the churches are still exempt from getting the stormwater fee. If we make it that we use the stormwater fee to pay back through Tabor, that would also exempt the churches from getting the stormwater rebate?
Let me say it this way. A church will not receive a benefit from a Tabor refund.
Okay. That's what I wanted to hear. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
That's the clearest way I can put that.
Ms. Franks?
Thanks, Mayor Paul. I guess just a couple of points. Number one, I didn't come very well prepared, not having the slide material, so I couldn't reach out to any constituents. So not sure I have good quality questions. But at this point, I just want to make a couple of comments on the committee construct. I just have concerns that, number one, I don't think we're ready for that. Two, the constituting of that, I would be concerned about making sure that we get a wide variety of voices to the table if we do that, meaning people who are dissenters. I mean, from every perspective. I think that a lot of my folks who are maybe opposed to certain things have felt left out of the conversation. So I think that that would be important if we get to that point. But I'm actually thinking that maybe we want to consider some type of a ranking criteria in some way to say, what's the benefit area of something? What's the recent investment? How long's the need been on the books? What's the cost of not doing it? Kind of the traditional things when you're ranking projects. And you go through, what's the cost of doing it? What's the cost of not doing that? If we defer the maintenance, are we making the problem worse? Meaning deferring X types of maintenance means that we could be incurring a larger cost. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of a mechanism that maybe our budget and audit committee members could go through that kind of buckets these and gets us into a more productive conversation, so then we can determine if we need a committee or if it can be done by council. But I think if they could take the stab at that sort of criteria matrix, which there's plenty of good ones out there for project assessment that you could kind of harvest from, that might get us to a list that then is quantifiable for here's what we think is needed, here's how it can be geographically dispersed to make sure that every area of the city is getting benefit. And then when it goes through that, then we come up with now here's the dollars we need to take on the top 10. Then we have a number, then we can decide to go forward plan. It just seems like if we broke it down a little bit more, almost like a program, we'd be in a better situation to then make decisions about how to administer it or get forward. So just some thoughts.
I think that's well said. I think the Budget and Audit Committee, could be a good resource potentially, as well as a community survey. To try to go out, but I don't know if we're too raw right now for that, but eventually maybe go out to the community with a survey and get that feedback, try to get as broad as we can. Mr. Abel?
I think council was elected to set these priorities. Certainly we want the community to give us input, but we control the purse strings through the budget, and I think if you get a committee going and some of them are from Ward 1, they're going to say, hey, we don't have enough open space on our side of town, so that's where the priority is. And we might have other thoughts from Ward 3 and Ward 2, and it would just maybe set certain parts of the community in conflict with others. Although the more outreach we do, the better. I just think that these final decisions, the priorities about where the money goes and what projects need to be done is our duty, and we have the fiduciary duty as well. So I'd also like to mention, in answer to Mr. Royball's question, since it's a stormwater fee the churches are paying, and that's an enterprise fund, and enterprise funds are Tabor exempt, the churches wouldn't qualify for a Tabor refund anyway because their fee doesn't go to a Tabor liable situation.
So just hold on real quick. It's 10:25. We're cool. 10:21. So we have our Budget and Audit Committee. Who also is Piper Jaffray. Who's our financial advisors?
Stiefel Nicholas.
Stiefel Nicholas. So potentially this could be an option to take what you've heard here to the Budget and Audit Committee, have our financial advisors there, and look for, I think the projects certainly are going to come back here, but we can have the community input. And I think we all pretty much know where those are, right? Infrastructure, parks, police usually is what we are good at in the community, and that's what we do, then it's kind of drilling down from there. And stormwater is interesting. We're going to learn more in a couple weeks about what that looks like. So is there an avenue to, you know, you only meet so often, but to have a special meeting amongst budget and audit, which is 3 community members and 3 council members, and to further this conversation, see if they have any recommendations, and have our financial advisor there come back with something more substantial, maybe something more detailed with project lists of things, so we can get an idea of what that looks like. And then that could help us maybe move to the next, because I'm just not getting a sense that everybody feels quite comfortable in the direction to go. And I think that's getting a lot of nods. So is that something that council would be willing to do? And maybe, okay. And set that out for, I mean, I don't know if a month is too aggressive or.
Well, I will tell you that the committee has a regularly scheduled meeting 3 weeks from tonight, and maybe we could add a little bit of time to it because it's not a very long.
Mr. Dorr, you could have said that at 10 o'clock.
I didn't want to interrupt you, Mayor. Beg your pardon. So we do have a regular meeting scheduled 3 weeks. We might just extend the time a little bit, but that's probably an minimum appropriate amount of time for our Public Works Director, Community Resources Director to do a little bit more fine tuning of some projects. And you know what we might task the committee to do is to come with a preparation for a small, medium, and large, I might call it. You know, I got some head nods there. That's good. Kind of a small, medium, and large basket of opportunity projects, programs, whatever the case may be. And I think it's wise to involve the city's financial advisors early. In fact, that's one more of the things in here, and so that they can have an idea of and tell us what's realistic and not realistic, you know, in terms of the marketplace and so forth. So, if that's the direction, then I'll begin on that.
There's still a few lights up, and let me just finish that out. But if that's an option to go forward, Mr. Beta.
Thank you, Mayor. If you're talking about referring this to the Budget and Audit Committee, let me remind you that we have just passed the policies and procedures, which, as I understand now, has put limitations on the terms of the members of the Budget and Audit Committee, and so I think that may require us to reconstitute that committee, whatever that requires, before we go forward with it. So I just want to throw that out there.
And if I recollect, that would just be potentially one member coming off, so you'll still have, and I'm not exactly sure when that date is, but we can keep that in mind as we go forward. Ms. Gutwein?
Thank you. I'm happy with this direction. I think that's a good use of our existing committee to take the first stab at this. The main thing I wanted to accomplish was just, you know, continuing the conversation and drill down to these priorities, which this committee, which committee does it does not really matter to me. So I think that's fantastic. And then I just wanted to add, you know, in addition to the small, medium, and large plan, I wonder if we could somehow look at, once the committee has looked at what the priority projects are, what the time frame would be to get them done if we do nothing. So let's say we wanted to have the Route Street Bridge, just as an example, if that's a priority identified by the Budget and Audit Committee, how long would it take us to get that done if we didn't pursue any of these options? Because I think that's an important consideration.
I would be able to guide the committee in that regard simply by the matter of the city's current capital improvement and preservation plan is a 5-year plan. So this Public Works and Community Resources Department, if it's in our capital improvement and preservation plan for 5 years, that's a very strong commitment to do that project. So you wouldn't see, there would only be things that aren't in the CIPP that would be a function of these small, medium, and larges. And then if it's not already in the CIPP, you can pretty well rest assured it's not going to get done in the next 5 years, if that makes sense. I think that would happen naturally, I guess is another way for me to put that.
That makes sense. And maybe we can just call that out as we continue this discussion so that the community understands that if it's not in this plan, it is going to take this amount of time, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. LeBeer.
Just one question before I make a comment. Are we looking at potential budget cuts at all at the end of this year as a result of this potential Tabor refund?
Not tonight. That's for sure. I can't tell you what August or next August or the following August may hold, but
okay, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm not anticipating that, but things change rapidly.
Got it. And then as far as the Budget and Audit Committee goes, as you know, I serve on that committee, and I don't know about Councilor Harrison and Beta, but I'm on the skilling model where I'm definitely down to take a aggressive approach and plan on having an additional meeting after the next meeting that we have, or having a 3-hour long meeting, or whatever we got to do to really dig in on some of these issues. So I just wanted to let you know.
Very well.
So yeah.
Councilor Beta's giving you a glare over there. Okay, so to sum up the direction, it would be to bring the financial advisors in, projects into budget and audit, have that conversation and see what kind of recommendations come out. I would also say to add public safety to that list. We've been talking infrastructure and parks, but not public safety.
Oh yeah, certainly.
So have that public safety.
And then, Mayor, would you be thinking about the right date, time, and venue and forum? Because I like to be specific about when any and all of us would come back to this body to report the findings. I think we'll have quite a, I would imagine that we would have an orientation and a first blush for the committee on April 23rd, perhaps a follow-up, and then I would guess that the committee, working as expediently as possible, would probably be prepared to return findings. So would it be prudent to schedule a future follow-up for council? It seems to me that would make sense.
Well, certainly, but I think we're going to have to figure out what your committee members can do, because you're talking potentially 2 or 3 meetings with the Budget and Audit Committee. Is that what I'm getting?
More than one, for sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, Mr. Goldstein?
Yeah, why don't we wait to schedule it after this, have first committee meeting, let's see what happens, and then we would have an aggressive calendar if council was looking at something for this November, but we could go ahead and still have time to work that in.
Sounds good.
That makes sense. And Mr. Abel has a clarification.
Yes, from you.
Oh.
You mentioned public safety. Are you, a few years back, public safety was supposed to get 0.5% of a sales tax increase, and it turned out that public safety was not just police, it was snow plows and stop signs and such. While those things are needed, I would hope that the public safety aspect of this is adding police officers and perhaps code enforcement.
Okay.
Is that what you had in mind when you said public safety?
So, well, that's exactly what I had in mind.
Thank you.
I'm not sure about the tax implementation.
No, that's long ago and far away. I just want to make sure that
Certainly.
that doesn't pop up again as
Okay.
kind of a red herring.
Do we have direction on that? I'm looking, all right.
Sorry, we're still laughing about
Implementation. Okay. All right. So we'll go forth, and for council, your members, if you would like to talk to them prior or have information that you'd like to share or questions, that's Councilors Harrison, Beta, and LeBeer, who will be taking on that challenge. So I envy you, and I don't. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dorr.
Good night.
All right. So that does lead us into committee reports, which first off the bat would be budget and audit. And so I don't know if any of those council members have an update that they'd like to share about the committee. I think maybe we can wait and have one coming up.
We talked numbers, thank you.
Okay.
I can add to that real quick if you want.
Sure.
Just simply, Mr. Dorr gave us a great overview of Tabor and over our revenue and expenses and just general information, really educating, I think, Councilor Beta and I on some of the inner workings. So it's very helpful. It was a broad overview, and I really appreciate it. So I just add that. Thanks.
Fair for that committee. Okay, so Jeffco EDC, they have quite a prospect list. I think they're always out doing different things and looking at different opportunities. But what did happen is they were awarded opportunity zones. 2 were in the city of Lakewood, and those were established by the Congress in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 to encourage long-term investments in low-income urban and rural communities nationwide. So the city of Lakewood has 2 of those designations. I sent that out to council with the descriptors of where they are. And at this point, I don't have a lot of information beyond that or what that's going to look like. I imagine it's a lot like a enterprise zone type of a amenity, but something to entice jobs or to keep jobs or to try to get reinvestment by existing businesses in those zones. So that should be pretty cool. And we need to have Jeffco EDC, and I think Ms. Nealon said that's going to be this summer. I think we're long overdue to have Jeffco EDC come out and talk to the community about what they do day in and day out. CML Policy Committee is Ms. Johnson and Mr. LeBeer. Anything to report?
Not at this time on the CML.
Okay. Head Start.
Head Start underwent an assessment earlier this year and came out with no findings, which means a clean bill of health. We have a shorter waiting list, but we do have a waiting list. And we got a report last month on the progress the kids have made since the first of the year, and it's remarkable.
Very cool.
They're making great strides.
That's great. Thank you for that. And the committee members of that is Councilors Abel, Vincent, and Franks. Jefferson County Criminal Justice Committee, Councilors Roybal and Skilling. Councilor Roybal, anything to update?
No, there's no report on that.
All right. Jefferson County Transportation Committee, Ms. Johnson.
Not at this time.
All right. Judge's salary, I think that'll be coming our way soon.
I think next week will be
Okay.
the first reading.
Here's a big one. The Legislative Committee, Chairwoman Johnson.
Thank you. We have a very robust committee, and I'd really like to thank the members because they work very hard. This has been a surprisingly light legislative season this year. It's been awesome. But there are just a couple bills I'll tell you that we're dealing with. Senate Bill 66, let me just say this too. We hear of a great variety of all kinds of issues, and this committee has been staying on top of all the different things that are at the state level, and I appreciate your input and hard work. One of the bills that we are dealing with is Senate Bill 66. It extends the operation of the state lottery division. It has moved from the Senate to the House, and this is one that the mayor also was in strong support of, and happy that we had the same thing. The bill extends the scheduled termination on July 1st of 2024 of the state lottery division in the Department of Revenue, but it's a good thing. There was a little loophole, I think, in Colorado Springs on that, right? Okay. House Bill 1240 that was going to sunset the Auto Theft Prevention Authority and Board. Strongly support, and friends, it has moved from the House to the Senate. The bills that we've been monitoring, we took a leave on Good Friday, and this was one that we would have gotten an update on. We've worked strongly with Judge Stavik. There's a few things that she's been very interested in that really affect our municipal court. One of them is House Bill 1089 that talks about no monetary conditions of bond for misdemeanors. The judge is handling the effort on this. She's really been very proactive at the Capitol. She's in strong opposition, and we back our judge and the knowledge and understanding she has of this. I'm not telling you what all the bills are about because the hour is late. Also Senate Bill 203, conflict-free representation in municipal courts. We are taking a neutral stand. If amended, the judge is handling this and working with the legislators on this as well. Amendments have been made, and it's ready for the legislators to continue their process. We're going to monitor to ensure that the amendments stay in place. And as the mayor is aware, these bills are a moving target from one day to the next oftentimes. And so on many things, we just monitor them. On some things, we're also neutral as well, which means they kind of drop off our radar. But that's my report.
Said, you guys are doing a great job, and now that there's, I think, less than 40 days left in the session, it'll probably get a lot busier, and you'll be chasing bills all over the place. So thank you for that. Ms. Gutwein, Denver Regional Council of Governments.
Thank you. Our March Board of Director meeting was canceled. So no report from that meeting, but the meeting before that, we also at DRCOG go through the bills at the state capitol and take a position as DRCOG and on bills that impact either aging or, of course, transportation. So we had an update on bills of there as well. And then the other kind of interesting thing was we got a report about a committee examining whether or not to host the Olympics in Denver, which, as you can all imagine, will have significant impacts if that were to move forward, and discussing and kind of preliminary just options and pros and cons. So we got a report on that as well, which I think will be very interesting to see what happens.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you. Screening committee, I think we hear from you a lot, but there are openings still.
We have been busy. We're going to be busy again with interviews. It's Councilwoman Vita, Councilwoman Franks, Councilwoman Sharon Vincent, and Councilwoman Harrison. We are in the midst of interviewing some really good candidates. We've had 2 sets of nominees that have been accepted recently, but we are also rewriting the questions that we ask our prospective candidates. A lot of the questions were duplicated each other, and others were just flat out not relevant. And some of them we always got a no to, like, and I believe with Planning Commission we ask if they've ever asked for a variance. And so far no one said yes. So we're going to get rid of that sort of thing and try to make the questions a lot more relevant and a lot more timely.
Cool. Sister Cities program, probably not much, but clearly David Schwartz knows a lot about our sister cities.
He does. No report.
Right. And then I have urban drainage and flood control, which is kind of cool. And we just updated the Sloan's Lake Major Drainage Way Plan, which is with the City and County of Denver, Edgewater, and Lakewood. If you think probably 20th and Wadsworth down. But to put it in perspective, this is just a master plan update. This would take over 400 units out of, or 400 dwellings out of the floodplain. 90 of those are in the city of Lakewood. Implementation to have that happen is about $45 million. So we just continue, you know, to crank away. But urban drainage is potentially going to look at asking the voters to debruce. And you'll probably hear more about that and see what that looks like and what those numbers would potentially look like to Lakewood going forward. Metro mayors, we also watch a lot of legislation. Our big one is the transportation, and watching Senate Bill 1, as well as another measure within the House that looks at funding. I think the latest proposal that passed the Senate unanimously, actually, was a $500 million transfer to CDOT, and then potentially $250 each year, $250 million each year, and going to the voters in 19 to ask for bonding. And then there's still in discussions of a potential sales tax increase ranging from 0.35 to 1 cent that would be dedicated to transportation. All of that stuff's really not going to come out until the legislative session is over with, which is the first week or two of May. So stay tuned for that. You'll probably hear a lot. And what else? So we'll just run into reports. MyWaterPledge.com. If you have the opportunity, go on. I think I signed up today, and by my pledge, I'm going to save 66,000 gallons of water. So we encourage all of the people in the city of Lakewood to take it. It's a pretty cool challenge with a lot of cities. Right now, we are ranked 222nd of the participating cities. So the more people we get to take a look, to get educated, to see the little things that you can do to save water, the better. It's a pretty cool deal. 40 West is just best of Westward for best suburban kind of arts experience. So congratulations to them as they keep rocking and rolling, going through all that good stuff. And then in my State of the City, I encouraged the community to pick one thing that they wanted to tackle. Mine was childhood hunger. So I had a meeting with Hunger Free Colorado. And what I didn't realize is probably the largest population of folks who go without food are seniors. And so it has made me rethink that to pretty much everybody who might be hungry in our community. And I got a lot of information, and if somebody thought that was going to be an easy task, I might have picked something a little bit easier. But it's meaningful, and I think there's a lot of things that we can do. And I'll continue to keep the city council up to date on what that looks like. But it was really interesting to hear the number in the seniors and the impact that seniors, how much more impactful on their life being suppressed to food can have. It was shocking. So that's what I got. I'm going to start on my left. Mr. Roy Ball.
No report.
Mr. Abel.
No more reports.
Ms. Harrison.
Dana's going to give it.
Mr. Skilling.
Our Ward 4 newsletter, thanks to Councilor Franks, just went out. If you didn't receive it in your email, that means you're not signed up, so you should probably sign up. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on all of the important things happening in our ward, and it also has all of our updates, as usual, about the goings-on here. And for those who aren't aware, this Wednesday is the Planning Commission Mixed Use and Housing hearing. They are accepting all comments, so put those comments in. You can put them online. I believe during the hearing, you can actually comment as well. But that's the Mixed Use and Housing this Wednesday in council chambers. So just a reminder to everybody to come out for that.
Thank you. Mr. LeBear.
No report.
Ms. Gutwein.
Our Ward 5 meeting is this Saturday, April 7th, 9 a.m., Bear Valley Church. The topic will be how to live sustainably in your own home, save money, etc. And then, of course, we will do a council update and discussion. Thank you.
Ms. Franks. Mr. Beta.
No report.
Ms. Vincent.
I'd just like to say I went online today and took my water pledge.
All right, 66,000 more.
That's the end of my report.
Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. Ward 1 meeting will be this Saturday, 9:30 at Holy Shepherd. Steve Jensen from the DA's office is going to give us an update on things happening there in the DA's office and impacts on our communities in this neighborhood. Please join us.
Mr. Goldstein, Mr. Graham, Ms. Millard. All right, and one last reminder, and because something came in today via the council request for action, ACIC would like assignments. So if you have something in mind and you want to submit it, please get those in and council can start having those discussions as well. They are eager to get to work on some different things. So with that, thank you all very much. We are adjourned at about 10:48 p.m.